Ottawa. But again, there are other provisions that could have achieved this. Section 129B of the Criminal Code gives police the option to require anyone with reasonable excuse to assist a public officer or peace officer in the execution of his duty in arresting a person or preserving peace. Frankly, Madam Speaker, it would appear that the only tools employed by the government that were not previously affordable to them was the financial powers. And these are the powers that have concerned so many people. Being debanked, even for a period of 30 days, could have serious impacts on an individual, not just for 30 days, but for 30 years to come. And the government actually considering making some of these tools permanent is even more concerning for all Canadians. When temporary powers become permanent powers, the concern for all Canadians is great. Madam Speaker, I conclude my comments with the words of former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. Parliament is more than procedure, it is the custodian of the nation's freedom. Madam Speaker, may we all live up to that duty today. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Your Honour, Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of National Revenue.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to start off with my question to the Honourable Member from Perth Wellington. First off, I would like to say thank you to all the police forces that were involved in over the weekend in executing a very diligent, very professional, judicious police matter. And a special thank you to the members of the York Regional Police that came in from my area and assisted. I would like to ask the member from Perth Wellington, the invoking of the Emergency Act is obviously a very time-limited, a very proportionate measure, obviously done with much consideration, and obviously, in my view, justifiable under the fact that what went on at the border crossings, the over 3-week occupation of our nation's capital by the protesters. And when I think of what has transpired, time-limited and proportionate, wouldn't the Honourable Member agree that this is a useful measure, a tool that has been used in a limited manner, and it is getting the job done, and we are getting to a point where the capital is opening up? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member for Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for Vaughan Woodridge for his question. He talks about this being a useful tool, being a useful measure. But I go back to my rural roots, and as a farm kid growing up, yes, it'd be nice to have that John Deere S-Series combine to get the job done. But we've spent a lot of years using the old John Deere 4400 combine, and it combined a lot of corn and soybeans, and it got the job done. The fact is, in this matter, there are a lot of tools that are available to the government that they simply didn't employ. The fact of the matter is that they went to the sledgehammer approach. They used the Emergencies Act when they could have used so many other acts and tools that were available short of the sledgehammer of the Emergencies Act.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to thank the colleague from Port Wellington for his speech. He talked about, in the beginning of his speech, about the division that he sees within our society. I see the same thing in the fact that this couldn't be expressed with a tweet. I think he sees the same problem that we all have. We're trying to respond to everybody on social media and explain in a few lines. It's very complex. There is division, and that's what I want to hear him on, division. Does he not believe that the government's negligence in having let the situation fester and doing, as he said, taking no action before they come forward with a sledgehammer, that is the Emergencies Act, and let people occupy the city for more than 20 days. We see the articles this morning from demonstrators who say they're coming back. I'd like to hear the member talk on that.
The Honourable Member for Perth Wellington.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague for his question. Yes, in fact, the government could have done much more before it used its recourse to the Emergencies Act. The government could have cooperated with the provinces and police forces across the country to use those forces before using or invoking the Emergencies Act. It is incredible that the government let this occupation and demonstrations continue before it went to the measures that they did use. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
appreciate the intervention from my honourable colleague. It was balanced, and it was calm, and it was fair. Something that hasn't necessarily happened here in the last few days all the time. So I appreciate that. One of the things that he was talking about, of course, was the fact that the government doesn't have to use this legislation. However, it was the Ottawa interim police chief himself who said it wasn't until he had the ability from the invocation of the Emergencies Act that he could actually do the job that he needed to do, that he could use all of those pieces of legislation available to him at all the different levels of government to do what he needed to do. Could he explain why the police chief in that specific position would actually say that if that wasn't the case? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
A member for Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member from London Fanshawe for her question and for her comments. I would say this, is that yes, different police forces have been able to use the Emergencies Act, but that doesn't mean that that was the only tool that was available to them. There are many measures that the government and the police forces could have used short of using the Emergencies Act, and I think that's the issue that we're facing here today. Using the sledgehammer of the Emergencies Act when other tools, other pieces of legislation were available. They may have been more cumbersome, but when we're dealing with the rights and freedoms of Canadians, sometimes that extra cumbersome process is needed. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. As you know, there's a common practice here in Parliament to thank our constituents when one of us rises to speak for the first time after an election. There's obviously a good reason for doing it beyond having good manners. It acknowledges one of the most important truths about this place. The people who live in our ridings are the reason why we are here, whether they voted for us or for someone else, or even if they didn't vote at all. This is the House of Commons, and it belongs to the people. So I would still like to once again thank the constituents of Cypress Hills Grasslands for sending me here as their representative. With the great privilege of standing here today on their behalf, I must speak for them and for their families. I will always try my best to do so. It always takes time and effort to hear from different people, reach out to them, and figure out what they're thinking, feeling, and experiencing. Sometimes we agree, and sometimes we disagree, and that's okay. But this task is absolutely worth it, no matter what. If I disagree with constituents, that should not prevent me from honoring them with the courtesy, dignity, and respect as people and as fellow Canadians. In fact, it's when we are challenged with competing thoughts and ideologies that we often make the best decisions for our constituents and our country. As a song from my youth says, not a diamond without the pressure. That is what it means to be a member of Parliament. Everyone has a role in the democratic process, but elected representatives have a duty to make an extra effort. A beautiful part of our parliamentary system is that the same people who serve as the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers are also just members of Parliament. For example, the current Prime Minister was elected as a member for Papineau, and the Leader of the official opposition was elected as the member for Portage-Lisgar. On either side of the House, they have to work in both roles at the same time. It remains true that before assuming public office in government, someone was first elected by the people of their riding to be their voice in Ottawa. That is their primary role. As ministers, they have simply added another responsibility to serve the entire nation, regardless of representation. But it should never change the fact that they are working here to represent the people of Canada to the government and not the other way around. If they ever forget it and become disconnected, they have completely lost their way. And I do believe that recent events so far show that we are losing our way as a nation. This point should be front of mind as we debate and vote on this government's emergency order. We have a perfect opportunity to remind a minority government that they should not be playing around with power. They should not be using the Emergencies Act to forsake their public responsibility. The Liberals need to come back down to earth. On Friday, with police action expected to begin here in Ottawa, the scheduled debate for the House of Commons was cancelled with short notice. I decided to go for a walk and look around the scene outside of Parliament for myself to get a sense of the situation at hand. As I did, I met a man who is proudly wearing military medals on his coat. He's a veteran who served our country overseas in Afghanistan. He told me that he made the long journey across Canada to be here because he's worried about the country that he loves, the country that he served, and he wants to stand for freedom. I thanked him for his service. I also talked to a school teacher that lives downtown, and she didn't feel threatened at all as she walked down near the front of the protests. She talked about how she used to be a big supporter of the Prime Minister, but can no longer support him because of his arrogance and lack of respect for other Canadians. what I saw and heard from these individuals was far from what the Prime Minister infamously called a small, fringe minority with unacceptable views. The disconnect was more obvious than ever, and it brought us some of the disturbing scenes in our nation's capital over the weekend after the Liberals invoked the Emergencies Act. The government's show of force has wounded our society, and this is likely to be the longest-lasting result of it. It's an outrage to see our Prime Minister invoke hateful rhetoric against those concerned for their freedoms, calling them a fringe minority and choosing to label them as racist and misogynist. Especially in difficult times, we need a Prime Minister who will put partisan politics aside for the common good. After all, the Prime Minister represents every Canadian. Every Canadian is one of his constituents. So for name-calling to be the first and only action taken by the government before using the Emergency Measures Act, it further shows the lack of respect he has for people who don't agree with him. There are many Canadians, vaccinated and unvaccinated alike, who recognize that Canadians should have the right to make medical decisions for themselves. After all, it is a change in the government's position on a vaccine exemption for truckers that has triggered all of this. Canadians should not have to face the question of taking a vaccine or losing their job. They should not be sent home from stores because they have not been vaccinated. They should not have to face a financial penalty simply because they're not vaccinated. Children should not be banned from playing sports because they are not vaccinated. No Canadian should have to face such dehumanizing treatment for simply choosing to not get vaccinated. That is not the Canada I grew up in, and that is not the Canada our children should grow up in either. Madam Speaker, you may recall that this past December, I rose in the House on behalf of all of those who lost their jobs and their livelihoods as a result of vaccine mandates. Following that statement, I received hundreds of emails from Canadians all across the country, sharing their personal stories, many of them devastating. I've heard from those who have lost their home because they no longer have a job or an income to pay the mortgage. I've heard from others who had to explain to their children that they could no longer join their friends at the hockey tournament. I've heard from students who are kicked out of their university programs. And more devastatingly, I've heard from parents who have lost a child to suicide and attribute the cause to lockdowns, to mandates, and to bullying. These people live in Liberal ridings as much as they live in mine, but does the government bother listening to them? It isn't enough for the Prime Minister to simply say, "We heard you," as an empty statement while clearing the streets. Vaccine mandates are wrong. They are morally wrong, and it's increasingly clear that they are a public policy failure. They are ruining livelihoods, clogging supply chains, stifling our economy, eroding medical privacy, and dividing society, all the while not living up to the earlier promises of defeating COVID. Why continue to act like they are a magic bullet out of the pandemic? Why continue to trample on protesters and Canadians' rights with little to show for it? When will the government finally take responsibility for their divisive policies, walk back their vaccine mandates, and actually consider a comprehensive plan to combat COVID-19, including access to therapeutics and increasing funding to provinces so they can ramp up ICU capacity? I'll also add that I believe an apology is due. An apology for treating those who are unwilling to get vaccinated or peaceful protesters as second-class citizens. They are not second-class citizens. They are as Canadian as you and I, and they are worthy of respect, dignity, and a listening ear. I also want to encourage NDP members to vote against the motion. Each time the War Measures Act was used, as the previous version of this legislation, it left behind wounds in our society after enabling real or perceived abuses of power. This is already turning out the same way. I don't expect to quote Tommy Douglas all the time, but I believe his precedent is worth considering. He described then Prime Minister Trudeau's use of the War Measures Act in Quebec as using a sledgehammer to crack a peanut. He stood on principle by voting against the grain at the time. There have been some misgivings in the NDP caucus about opening Pandora's box, but they say they want to fix it somehow with an inquiry after the fact. One of their former caucus colleagues who served as a member for Regina Louvain even used the same quote from Tommy Douglas to challenge the current NDP's stated intention to support Liberal overreach. I hope they'll listen to their own people, even if they're from my province. Over the many hours of debate that I have sat in on, I've only heard a handful of Liberals even try to outline a reason for invoking the Act, and it is a stretch at best. Some tried to use the blockades around the country as the reason. Unfortunately for the Liberals, they were all mostly cleared prior to invoking the Act. Another tried to say they needed to compel tow truck companies to move some of the semis and vehicles. Once again, they are found to be wrong, as my colleagues from Haldimand, Norfolk, and from Perth, Wellington have already pointed to existing laws that provided that ability. The last reason they gave was to stop the foreign funding of the Freedom Convoy. This does not constitute a national emergency. Unfortunately for the Liberals, yet again, a couple $1 million donated to a crowdfunding campaign were halted without the use of the Emergency Measures Act. We have witnessed over $1 billion in foreign funding come into Canada over the last number of years to intimidate workers in the energy sector, lead misinformation campaigns, and stop pipeline projects and resource developments, and not a word of concern from the federal government or the NDP for that matter. The effects of this reached a new level this past week when an axe-wielding protesters injured an officer and destroyed heavy machinery and buildings on site in BC, and still not a word of concern. Is it because they support that protest? Or is it because they know that if all this foreign money were to be investigated, that their friends and supporters might be implicated by it? If they're going to use this flimsy narrative of foreign funding, then they better be consistent in their approach to it. If nothing else, after all that has been happening in Ottawa, I hope that we can learn the correct lessons. Let's listen better to Canadians, and let's keep this Liberal government in check. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells. The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Yes, sorry, Madam Speaker. I was attempting to get this microphone connected here properly. The honourable member talks about freedom. And I'm wondering which freedoms he's trying to preserve. The freedom to overthrow the government, the freedom to terrorize people in Ottawa, the freedom to choke off billions of dollars in trade, the freedom to flout the law after everybody was very, very clear on what the people in Ottawa, at Coots, at the Ambassador Bridge wanted. Are those the freedoms that he's trying to protect?
The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, I want to thank the member for his question. You know, let's be clear. There's nobody in this House that supports the unlawful overthrow of the government. We live in a democracy, after all. But at the end of the day, the issues that we're hearing are people who feel like they're not being heard by the government. They're feeling abandoned by the government. And so they came to Ottawa to protest. We've seen protests pop up across the country. And, you know, unfortunately, we've seen blockades of critical infrastructure that have led to the loss of millions of dollars to the economy. And that's definitely unfortunate. But thankfully, the RCMP, without the use of the Emergency Measures Act, were able to step in and get the job done and open the borders and open the crossings back up and restore our commerce.
The
honourable member for Manicouagan. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for his speech and put the following question to him. He has mentioned respecting his constituents. I think that is the very basis of the work that we all carry out. And I dare think it's also the basis of the work that the Prime Minister is called on to carry out. Now, I would like to know, given that this crisis is due to the failures of the Prime Minister, I'd like to know what he could have done better.
Merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you very much for this question.
I really think that, you know, opening that dialogue, not going from 0 to 100 would have been a great first step. You know, we saw the mayor of Ottawa, even though he clearly did not agree with the protesters, what they were doing, the mayor of Ottawa actually went out and tried to talk to and to meet with the organizers. And he was able to talk to them and make some arrangements to kind of free up some of the side streets to get people to move around and to get some of the people to go home. You know, the Prime Minister has a job to be a statesman, to be willing to stand and to be able to talk to people and really hear what their concerns are. So without that happening, that's got to be the first step that happens. And then we can kind of build from there. Then we can start looking at some of the other laws that we already have in place. We already heard members talk about laws that would have allowed for the clearing of parked vehicles. We didn't see any of the bylaw enforcement on vehicles that were in the middle of the street for longer than the bylaws allowed them to be there for. So there are some very simple measures that could have been done. But, you know, again, we need some leadership. We need to listen to Canadians.
Question, the honourable member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank my colleague for his intervention. His party and the Bloc continue to talk about the Ambassador Bridge and the corridor being safe, but now the Jersey barricades are moved amongst the community, and he talked about listening to constituents, and I don't understand why they continue to propagate the fact that things are okay. In fact, right now, we're dealing with a bomb threat to the mayor and his house. A person has been arrested. So I'd like him to respond to that, because since this has been going on, the mayor has to take leadership down here. And since the situation has escalated so much, he has now actually received a bomb threat to his house and to his family, and a person has been arrested. Would he speak specifically to that? Because that has actually been happening right now.
For Cypress Hills Grasslands has 1 minute to respond.
I want to thank the member for his question, and through you, Madam Chair, you know, obviously nobody ever deserves to have a bomb threat on their house for simply trying to stand up and do their job. You know, the mayor is doing what he can to best serve his constituents, and you know, I think the part of the question is that things are not okay, and he's right, things are not okay. People all across this country have felt disrespected for far too long, have felt like they've been vilified and divided, and done so on purpose for only political gain. So I think the constructive dialogue needs to happen. The Prime Minister had a role to play, and if the Prime Minister would have done his job, I feel that the tensions would not be where they are at down in Windsor West and in surrounding ridings, where things have gotten to, you know, to the point where somebody has done something so unfathomable, unthinkable, as to offer up a bomb threat. That's ridiculous.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Chatham-Kent Leamington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I join this debate with a great sadness and disappointment in my heart this morning. Please make no mistake, it is always an honour to be the voice of the residents, the citizens of Chatham-Kent Leamington in this chamber. But I'm sad because of the toil that the current situation continues to have on Canadians, and the fact that so much of this is unnecessary and avoidable. The fundamental question that the government has put before us today is this: do we believe that the Public Emergency Act is the right tool for right now? Has the rightfully high threshold for a public order been met? If the question is, how do we remove the protest, the blockade, the occupation that was encamped outside these doors, then shouldn't the question be, what enforcement tools does current legislation lack to address the illegal activities outside this House? And yes, let me be clear, illegally parking a semi, excessively blowing horns, harassment, those all contravene bylaws, but these violations are subject to fines, to towing, injunctions, an existing remedy under existing laws, provincially, municipally, and under existing law enforcement, and they can be reinforced with help from federal police forces without invoking this act. After all, is that not what cleared the illegal blockades in Surrey, in Windsor, Emerson, and Coutts? And I'm very thankful for law enforcement intersecting with truly dangerous elements caught with illegal guns and ammunition near Coutts. So thank you to our undefunded police forces. If the question is, does a basic interpretation of the Emergency Act determine that its threshold for invocation has been met? Or are we more concerned that we are being asked to give this Prime Minister great powers, given his history of deception and his disrespect for the law? This Prime Minister asks us to trust him, to give him unlimited authority to implement, and I quote here, other temporary measures authorized under Section 19 of the Emergencies Act that are not yet known. This, the only Prime Minister convicted for ethics violations, not once, not twice, and he avoided a third conviction not due to lack of evidence, not lack of intent. This, the only Prime Minister ever to sue, Madam Speaker, your office to keep this very House, from this very House, documents ordered released by Parliament with respect to the Winnipeg Virology Lab. Trust me, he asks of us. Trust me with power never before invoked or confirmed by this House under this Act. It seems that when faced with difficult situations, this Prime Minister's go-to response is to grab as much power as he can. Just think back to immediately after the declaration of the pandemic in March of 2020. This Prime Minister responded by attempting to give this government unlimited, unfettered taxing and spending powers without parliamentary oversight. His instinct was not to come to this House and enter into dialogue to determine the path forward. Yes, Her Majesty's loyal opposition does sit on this side of the chamber and might not have immediately agreed to every point put forward. But he was forced to enter into dialogue and debate with us. And he demonstrated through we demonstrated through our following actions that we would support emergency measures when properly engaged. Similarly, this Prime Minister did not engage with dialogue with Canadians involved with this protest. He does not have to agree with them, but he does, or he should, have to listen. This very process of listening, of engaging, de-escalates any situation. It is the hallmark characteristic of a leadership. Name-calling, dividing, stigmatizing, traumatizing, and grabbing for power. That escalates any situation. It is a hallmark characteristic of, well, you fill in the blank, through you, Madam Speaker. If the question is, how does the Prime Minister try to cover up his record of governing mistakes, then will this attempt to redirect public attention work? Clearly, the answer is no. Inflation will not be reduced. Our debt will not be addressed. Interest rate rises won't be blunted. Immigration backlogs won't be addressed. Labor shortages will not be alleviated. Housing prices will not drop, and budgets will not balance themselves. If the question is, how does invoking this Emergency Act fit into the government's plan, their overall plan to get us from a pandemic to an endemic situation? Well, again, for this question, Madam, there's a very clear answer. No, it doesn't do that because there continues to be no plan. Mr. Speaker, history will show that we got into this crisis, into this situation in our nation's capital, because this government did not have a plan to transition from pandemic to an endemic situation. This government's lack of a plan by which businesses in Chatham-Kent-Leamington, or anywhere in the country actually, could predictably manage their staff, their business and investment decisions, this continues to cause unnecessary hardship and failure. But the failures are not theirs, Madam Speaker. It is this government's problem. This government's failure to plan, this government's lunging from problem to problem with no coherent plan that could better multiply our effectiveness through our collective capacity. Farmers and greenhouse operators, small businesses in my riding and again across Canada continue to live with the uncertainty of labour supply, of border access, of supply chains. These supply chains, Madam Speaker, they want to see a plan. Our healthcare system wants to see a plan for surge capacity. It's not the bricks and mortar that's missing. It's the human resources, the people, for which this government did not plan to resource. This government's lack of a plan is evident by the fact that we are so late in acquiring sufficient rapid tests. We are so late in developing domestic vaccine manufacturing capacity. And we are so late in coordinating coherent, integrated, science-based messaging from our healthcare leaders to our political leaders. Madam Speaker, it's been more than 2 years since the pandemic came to Canada, and we still have no plan for living in an endemic state. Canadians did what was asked of them. They got vaccinated, they stayed home, they safely distanced, they forewent family gatherings, travel, and basic but essential human contact, all to do their part. And what has been the reward for the citizens of Chatham-Kent-Leamington, or for any Canadians, for what they did? More divisiveness, greater stress, more lost jobs, out of control inflation, economic uncertainty, and still no plan. Like all of us here, I have friends on both sides of the challenge before us. Something has happened in our country that may never be replaced. The capacity for kindness that Canadians are known for has been strained by our nation's leader, who has used the politics of division rather than cooperation and understanding. There's a sadness that comes when Canadians are pitted against Canadians. Madam Speaker, there's more than enough to blame to go around. Was the City of Ottawa woefully unprepared and made serious mistakes at the beginning of this situation, despite the many days of notice that a convoy was coming? Many people would say yes. Was the province slow to table resources? Again, many people would say yes. But here, in the centerpiece of our nation's capital, the question before us today is twofold. First, where's the plan forward? Even when this crisis outside these walls is resolved, we will simply return to this question and the need for an endemic plan to return to normalcy. The second question is, of course, the legislation before us today. Madam Speaker, simple common sense tells us that if we take the total of what the Prime Minister expects the Emergency Act to bring and subtract it from what is already covered under the existing laws and resources, then I respectfully submit that the difference with what we are left with pales in comparison to the constitutional precedent that we are asking this House to confirm. Madam Speaker, I must vote against these measures. The Emergency Act is not a substitute for leadership, but rather a consequence of the lack of it. The Prime Minister loves telling Canadians he has our backs. Well, he uses the approach of trying to hide behind us while pointing at those with whom he believes are to blame. You can't lead from behind. You lead by engaging conversation, even with those with whom you disagree. The only good thing that may come from enacting this act is that there will be an inquiry, an accountability review that will no doubt expose and document for history that when Canada was at one of its greatest challenges, the response from this government was a grab for power through the tactics of division and the lack of any plan forward. Let us get on with responsible endemic living. Canadians have done their job. Now let us do ours. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I find it interesting that the member, and this is so typical of Conservatives, is already willing to provide this House with the outcome of a public inquiry that will happen afterwards. You know, that underscores the Conservative game in here. It doesn't matter. This member doesn't care about the public inquiry that will happen. He's already determined the outcome. He just informed this House what it would be. You know, and that's, you know, the unfortunate reality of this. Would this member not rather like to actually have a public inquiry that looks into the matter and comes to its own decisions? Or would he rather just tell us what the outcome is going to be right now?
Honourable Member Chatham-Kent-Leamington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And despite the delivery, I want to thank my honourable colleague across the way for the question. And I'm thankful to the forebears of this legislation that they incorporated the process of an inquiry into it. And I am open to be wrong in my prediction of what that inquiry will state. But given the history that we, as Canadians, have experienced from this government, I'll stand respectfully, Madam Speaker, behind my prediction.
The
Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was heard just recently that Ambassador Bridge, well, there's still many things going on there. So I have a question for my colleague. Much as I said earlier, Ambassador Bridge was cleared before this act was invoked. That said, though, the statute at issue now, I would like to know whether my colleague thinks it really will be needed to finish the work in order to continue to offer the people safety and peace.
Leamington.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my honourable bloc colleague for the question. As she stated, the blockade, the occupation at the Ambassador Bridge was cleared prior to the invocation of this act. Was it cleared with the cooperation of our various police forces? There. Ongoing situations there, I condemn them. But they are able to be cleared with existing forces. It's the draconian imposition of this act and all that entails, all the precedent, as I mentioned in my remarks, that I think is of great concern to this side of the House. We support law and order here. We condemn the illegal occupation, the illegal blockades. But as so many of my colleagues have pointed out, resources exist to address them, without resorting to resources that are not required to address issues.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a very simple question for my honourable colleague. Has he heard anything from the Liberal government to date that would, A, justify the invocation in the first place, but more importantly, now that these illegal blockades have been dealt with, that requires the Act to still be in existence? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member Chatham-Kent-Leamington.
No. I could expand, but quite frankly, no. The implied or directly addressed in that Act are ongoing powers that are not required. And I think one of the ones that concerns us the most here are the ongoing financial powers dealt with now through the banks with the possibility of freezing accounts and things like that. Again, if there are crimes being committed, existing legislation empowers a government to go after those breaking the law through large donations, through proper existing sources, not a $20 donation for a T-shirt to support a cause that is symptomatic of so much unrest in this country. It is a sad time that we've come to this point in our country.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to start by saying I'll be splitting my time with the honourable member from Nickel Belt. So, I rise today to speak on this important motion. The decision to invoke the Emergencies Act is being taken with much consideration. This debate is crucial and necessary. For weeks now, the unlawful occupation and illegal blockades have disrupted the lives of Canadians, harmed our economy, and endangered public safety. We've witnessed intimidation in our communities and at our borders. The Emergencies Act has been invoked to supplement federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal authorities to address and resolve these issues. The impact of these blockades are significant. For 3 weeks, they've caused serious harm to our economy, our livelihoods, and our way of life. They've threatened our democracy and marred Canada's international reputation. These measures are being implemented in part to halt the illegal actions of those whose intention is to overthrow our democratically elected government, to stand up to those who wish to extort change by intimidation and attempt to overthrow our democracy. The measures implemented in the Emergencies Act are not broad and overreaching. They are specific and targeted. They are not permanent. They are temporary, set for 30 days or less. And they are not heavy-handed. They are proportionate. And the level of proportionate response is dictated by cooperating levels of law enforcement, not the government. These short-term measures have allowed law enforcement at all levels of government to work in ways they could not have previously. The Emergencies Act spells out a clear process that must be followed once the Act is invoked. The specific measures of the Act are subject to numerous checks and safeguards, including the oversight of a parliamentary committee. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is enshrined in this Act. By invoking the Act, a public review will automatically be triggered. The review ensures transparency and oversight. I've heard from some whose concerns that our invoking this Act will set a precedent. I'm confident that the criteria to invoke the Act have been met. The precedent I will not stand for is to give in to lawless occupations and blockades who demand that governments negotiate with them or be undemocratically replaced. All actions under the Act will comply with our Charter. That requirement is built in to the legislation. Canadians expect us to act within the bounds of the Charter, and we will live up to these expectations. Despite the misguided efforts of a few, our democracy remains strong. However, we cannot be lulled into a sense of complacency. Attempted blockades have persisted. Because of the Act, additional attempts have been thwarted. New powers were used as recently as a few days ago to prevent a resurrection of a border blockade. This problem is clearly national, and it's still a threat. The unfortunate radical populism that fuels people to block supply chains and disrupt daily lives has not gone away. The pattern of rhetoric that can be linked to far-right extremism is well documented. We must not minimize the reality of this threat. What has emerged is an entrenched, organized movement that is being motivated by toxic ideology, groups that don't believe in the legitimacy of government. They knew where it hit Canadians, our borders, supply chains, and our communities. The Emergencies Act will leverage tools to end these disruptions and prevent future ones. The Act has allowed law enforcement to restrict access to Ottawa's downtown core. By creating a secure zone, authorities were able to stop an influx of more people and vehicles, preventing them from becoming entrenched in the capital. It's important not to confuse illegal blockades and occupations with legal protest. Canadians can continue to teach their children about democratic right to assemble peacefully and legally. It's an important part of sharing our values. But this is different. Make no mistake, bouncy castles, toboggans, and hot chocolate do not make an illegal protest a safe place for children. This was a dangerous situation, yet parents continued to bring their kids to the front line of these unsafe scenes. This act seeks to protect children, like those who have been used right outside these doors, as human shields for the adults who are supposed to keep them out of harm's way. The Emergencies Act prohibits parents from bringing children under the age of 18 to an illegal occupation. It does not prohibit children from attending peaceful and legal protests with their families. Recent events here in Ottawa and at multiple border crossings demonstrated that the ordinary mechanisms in place at multiple levels of jurisdiction were not sufficient. The subsequent inquiry that is mandated will help uncover the reasons other measures were not effective. These measures were enacted, are already working, and we're already seeing results. We're restoring the rights and freedoms of those who have been deeply affected, the rights of citizens to safely walk their streets, the rights of workers to earn a living, the rights of businesses to stay open and to serve customers, and the rights of people and goods to move freely across international borders. The debate we're having now and the review process that will follow will allow us, in a transparent and democratic way, to strengthen the gaps that allowed this situation to happen. This will ensure that we learn and adapt, so we will not have to mobilize the Emergencies Act in the future for the same reason. In that way, the Emergencies Act is a self-correcting piece of legislation. These measures have not been enacted because of the ideology of the people protesting. That is not the case. This act was invoked to put an end to illegal blockades and unlawful occupations. The city of Ottawa is recovering. Businesses are starting to open, and people are starting to get back to their lives. I believe that crisis reveals character, and I'm certain Canadians have the capacity to heal the damages done with dialogue, with compassion, and with respect. I want to commend the professionalism and controlled and proportionate response of law enforcement officials of jurisdictions over the past few days. And I also want to commend journalists and reporters for the important role they played throughout the crisis. Their work in very difficult circumstances has been remarkable. The violence and harassment they were exposed to is unacceptable. We need to stand together, all of us in this House, and condemn the hate speech and harassment that we're seeing. Doing nothing, saying nothing about the attempts to intimidate journalists is the same as supporting what is being done to them. Not condemning is condoning it. I ask my colleagues to consider that as they see members of the media being threatened by angry mobs. I'd like to address my constituents, the residents of Kitchener-Conestoga. Thank you for taking the time to reach out to me. There's been a diverse range of sentiments, and I've listened to your views very carefully. The conversations, the emails, the messages I've received all weigh into this decision. I was elected to be Member of Parliament for all constituents in Kitchener-Conestoga, not just the ones who share my views. I understand and I take seriously my obligation to hear everyone's views, to listen. I strive to respect and value the opinions of others. The impacts of the border blockades have been felt in our riding as people were laid off at local plants. Toyota, one of the largest employers, was idled, impacting many families in our community. Local feed mills and other businesses I spoke to in Kitchener-Conestoga were not able to get goods across the border. A big thank you to the truckers and trucking companies in Kitchener-Conestoga who kept going despite those blockades. I understand the magnitude of this vote. The research I've done, the briefings I've attended, the debates I've been part of in this House, and the conversations with constituents have brought me to this moment. Not an easy moment. But I did not become a Member of Parliament to do the easy things. I became a Member of Parliament to do the right things. Madam Speaker, invoking the Emergencies Act is the right thing. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Cumberland Colchester.
You know, it's interesting, the member opposite is speaking about dialogue, compassion, respect as being part of the process here. I just wonder, Madam Speaker, if the member opposite could outline 3 things this Prime Minister did that would encompass those things of dialogue, compassion, and respect, because realistically, I think the Canadians who were out there protesting, Madam Speaker, didn't see any of that, and then all we ended up with this ham-fisted approach of the Emergencies Act. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for that question. Being kind, being compassionate, being respectful, this is not a checklist. This is just what Canadians are, and we need to do that more. Mostly it starts by listening and having those dialogues. We need to be respectful about it. If you will disagree and you call my office, if you send an email to me, I can handle that. But parking a truck and blocking traffic at a bridge or taking over a city for 3 weeks is not the proper way to do dialogue, and that's not something we're willing to accept here in Canada.
Questions et commentaires, l'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm quite surprised still by the Liberal discourse. They've said for several days now that this measure was reasonable and necessary, and several times they've repeated that it wasn't their first recourse, nor the second or third. And every time we ask the question, we don't have any answers. We get vague answers, generalities. You're saying, oh, you know, it's important, there are extra tools. Well, I'll take this opportunity that I have here because the honourable colleague from Kitchener-Conestoga is a person I respect very much, and we've worked together at committees. And I know that this member generally works for the common good with an attempt to achieve results. So I will ask him, please, can he answer me, considering that we know each other somewhat and that we're friends, I hope so at least, can he talk to me about the 3 steps that happened before the adoption of the Emergencies Act? Because I didn't see them, and no one else did either.
Toga.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague and my friend across the aisle. I'm practicing French. If I were any better, I'd try and answer, but I want to make sure that I can express myself clearly. We do work well together in the chamber, and I think the idea that we're invoking these acts right now shows the safeguards that are going to be in place, the dialogue that's going to happen, the debate we've had for multiple days now, from early in the morning till the middle of the night. That is how we solve problems. That is how we handle crisis. We do it together with dialogue. We're going to have that committee that's going to be formed. That makes sense too. And the act can be revoked earlier than 30 days if Parliament deems it necessary. So I think these are proper steps to do. And after that, we're going to have a review to find out what happened, what worked, what can be improved. So these are all steps that we need to take to make sure that we can work together, but it starts with dialogue and it starts with listening. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member. Unfortunately, one thing that many of us can agree on is that we are here today because of a failure of many levels of government. You know, we all saw when this convoy was coming in, the police opened their arms to this convoy coming in, despite the fact that they had a clearly stated goal of overturning our democratically elected government. On the other hand, when we look at the experiences of those on Indigenous nations, such as that of a woman recently on Wet'suwet'en territory who had her door knocked down with axes and chainsaws and pulled out of her home. I'm wondering if the member can speak a little bit to the deferring treatment that has been received to those in the convoy versus those who are defending their land, and if we can find a way to come together now that we are in this position.
Brief answer from the member for Kitchener-Conestoga.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I respect that question, and that's a fantastic question. We do need to look at this. We need to look at what happened. We need to look at the biases that we have in our day-to-day lives, those unconscious biases that allow us to treat people differently and not with equality and equity. I believe that hopefully as we talk about this and report on it, that we'll find how we can do better in the future and make sure that all Canadians are treated properly. Thank you.
Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Official Languages. Madam Speaker, thank you. I was elected in 2015 as the member for Nickel Belt, and I never thought I would be here to make a speech in the House of Commons on any bill regarding an emergency measures debate. But here we are today. I'm very proud to represent the people of Nickel Belt for a third time, to make a difference in my community.
31st, for the House of Commons session, I have seen the events firsthand. So many lives, livelihoods, and businesses in Ottawa have been impacted in a very negative way. The right to protest is fundamental. I saw and supported the right to protest with the rolling truck convoy in my riding that rolled through Highway 17 on January 28th, driving towards Ottawa. But, Madam Speaker, This is different. When the truck convoy parked and camped on the city streets of Ottawa, this became illegal. Also, when we see a movement propped up with hate, racism, intimidation, we have to ask ourselves, what are we truly supporting? Let's be clear. Many people demonstrating were doing this peacefully. However, this became an illegal occupation, and it needed to end. Wishing my colleagues, the residents of Ottawa, and all involved parties safe and peaceful transition as the city is getting back to the residents. This agreement should not incite violence or threats. We are more Canadian than that. Political criticism is at an all-time high. I commend all my colleagues, federal staff, and my constituent staff for remaining at the public service even through these most difficult moments. I want to thank Nickel Belt constituents with different opinions and voicing their points of view in a respectful way. With over 91,000 voices to represent in Nickel Belt, we may not all agree, but we mostly certainly all wish for a healthier, more united, and stronger region. I am grateful to be in Ottawa to represent the residents of Nickel Belt and will continue to advocate for their priorities and strive to deliver solutions. It's been a long 2 years. Everyone has been affected by the pandemic in some way. There is so much misinformation circling, some different opinions being shared, but there is a lot of positive. We need to reach out to people in need in each of our communities. And a special thank you to my exceptional constituent office staff. Despite the vulgar, intimidating tactics and threats in the office, my team remains committed to helping you, and here's a few examples. Helping Mary, a senior with OIS and GIS benefits, helping Evelyn with affordable housing, helping Helen, a single mom with a Child Canada benefit, helping John with a disability pension application, and much more. This hasn't been easy for everybody. This hasn't been easy for everybody. The pandemic has altered the course of normal life for almost 2 years. You have a right to be fed up, to be tired, and frustrated.
The Emergencies Act is difficult. Being in government is difficult because you have to make decisions for the health and safety of citizens. The last 3 weeks, the blockades illegally were disrupting the lives of Canadians and endangering public safety. It was clear that the ability of local police forces to effectively enforce the law was seriously affected. We're invoking the Emergencies Act to strengthen the ability of provincial authorities to deal with blockades and occupations, to keep Canadians safe, preserve jobs, and restore confidence in our institutions. Through the Emergencies Act, we are giving new powers to police forces to regulate crowds, ban blockades, and keep key corridors open. The Emergencies Act allows the government to mobilize essential services, such as tow trucks, and allows the RCMP to act more quickly to enforce local laws, and gives us stronger authority to stop the flow of illegal funds from foreign sources. Our government cannot accept endless disruption. Our government will always respect the right of Canadians to protest. However, that right does not extend to occupying streets, breaking laws, and shutting down major trade corridors. This siege and blockades are causing significant damage to our economy and to our democracy. Specific measures provided by the Emergencies Act are limited, subject to numerous controls, and must comply with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. A parliamentary review committee will be established in the coming days to review the exercise of powers during a state of emergency. These measures will be time-limited, geographically targeted, and reasonable and proportional to the threats they are intended to address. Important for the people of Nickel Belt The Emergencies Act contains several significant limitations, controls, and safeguards, and a public inquiry within 1 year. Ottawa's acting chief of police, Vern White, Harper-appointed senator and former Ottawa police chief, Conservative Premier Doug Ford, all three indicated how important and essential the statement of emergency measures were for the coordinations of all municipal, provincial police forces across the country and the RCMP to ensure safety and to reform the existing laws. Also, I quote Michael Kemper, professor of criminology at the University of Ottawa, "We wouldn't be here keeping order safely in a crowd if it weren't for the Emergencies Act." It is extremely important. It motivated people to leave and signaled that there would be major consequences.
Of Nickel Belt, I appreciate why the criticism comes my way. I've signed up to be your MP, your voice in Ottawa, and although we may disagree sometimes, I do appreciate each of you reaching out. I see all the correspondence that comes to my office, lots of varied opinions on all sides. These next few weeks will be difficult, and people might feel left down. We all need to listen better. Thank you to each person who has reached out to someone in need. Thank you to our frontline workers. Thank you to our law enforcement police officers and to the Greater Sudbury police officers for coming to Ottawa, as many others across the country have done. RCMP and OPP officers, local authorities, to keeping us Canadians safe and helping democracy move forward. The restraint these people, these men and women, showed in the past few weeks in Ottawa have been remarkable. I hear from my constituent, some people want mandates to continue for a little while longer because they still have concerns and want a safe, balanced approach to reopening fully. They support the government's decision, and some people don't agree with federal or provincial government's position on mandates. Some wholeheartedly support the truck convoy and denounce those who try to weaponize this movement. All I know is we must stick to our Canadian values, democratic process, where we value respect, we denounce intimidation, and we choose to collaborate. Your MP is your voice, and I'm committed, as ever, to each of you. I have kept a grassroots approach when engaging with Nickel Belt constituents and continue to meet with individuals with varying opinions on the topic while seeking to preserve the safety and health of our community. We need to grow the region. We need to do this together. And thank you for the opportunity to speaking to you today. Madame la Présidente, merci. Thank you, Annie Miigwech.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've heard many things from Liberal members throughout this debate that I disagree with. But I want to zero in on one thing I agreed with that the member said, which is he said that he supported the right for peaceful protest prior to blockades, and he did not agree with blockading critical infrastructure. These are sentiments that fundamentally I agree with. Now, the provisions of the Emergency Act that I'm most concerned about are the powers given to arbitrarily freeze individuals' bank accounts without a court order. And we're hearing reports of individuals who have had bank accounts frozen, who donated to the convoy movement prior to any blockading, who wanted to see peaceful protests, who wanted to see the convoy movement be able to bring its message about the need to end mandates. And now those individuals are seeing their bank accounts frozen. I would contend that this is in violation of the Charter, and I would contend that giving banks this sweeping power, freezing individuals' accounts who made small donations in good faith, potentially without being in support of blockading, that this is totally unreasonable. And I wonder if the member would agree with me that that is not an appropriate way to be proceeding.
The honourable member for Nickel Belt.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my honourable member for that important question. Obviously, these emergency powers are important to keep law and order. Let's be clear. we've had the support of the Canadian Chiefs of Police, the interim chief of the Ottawa Police. We've had also Premier Ford indicating, Conservative Premier of Ontario indicating that these measures are important to restore law and order in the community. As we move forward, we'll need to look at evaluating, and if it was clearly identified that this was an illegal occupation and people needed to leave, and people did not leave, and there are consequences for their actions, and we will continue to monitor the situation as we go forward. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for some of the comments, including the word of thanks to the police forces. I fully agree they did extraordinary work. The police... Well, I have a question for my colleague. I heard that public safety, jobs, businesses were so important to him. Obviously, the siege lasted more than 3 weeks. I wonder, is my colleague saying that the government could not deploy the number of RCMP officers when the City of Ottawa was asking more than 1,800 in order to take action? Is the Emergencies Act something that ensured that what happened a few days ago was necessary, or rather, the Honourable Member for the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary? Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for the question. Yes, the measures were necessary. We heard from the acting police chief of Ottawa. We heard from the Premier of Ontario and a number of stakeholders who said that the trucks stopped and people were in this downtown area, that there were exceptional measures that they needed in order to take those people out. It's clear that the measures were necessary. We saw it in recent days, how the police forces of the RCMP, the provincial police forces, and police forces from across the country came here. And the Emergencies Act was clearly needed in order to restore peace here in the streets of Ottawa. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Windsor West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The situation at the Ambassador Bridge continues to be misrepresented here. The Ambassador Bridge is owned by a private American billionaire, one of the richest in the United States. And ironically, Madam Speaker, the barricades have now been moved off the Huron Church Road to there, and it's along the corridor. And the bloc misrepresenting this is kind of puzzling, because this is over 300 years of Francophonie culture that we have in that area, settled by Jesuit over 320 years ago. Now, the Conservatives now are supporting a private American billionaire who now has the concrete barriers blocking off the businesses and the employees and the public along this corridor. It's literally a runway to the 401 right now. I'd like to ask my honourable member, will he support compensation for border communities similar to what Ottawa has received for all the businesses and the activity that continues to exist to this day? Ottawa is cleared up, this area isn't. And I can't understand why we're preoccupied with protecting a private American billionaire who has sued the government dozens and dozens of times.
I'm sorry, I did ask for a brief question, and we are out of time, so I do want to ask the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to respond with a quick response, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the colleague for the intervention and the hard work in the region of Windsor for many years. He is quite right. People, businesses, the people in the Windsor area need support. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Oxford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Before I begin, I must admit or suggest that I will be sharing my time with a member from Tobiac-Mactaquac. Madam Speaker, Canadians across the country are gravely concerned. The Prime Minister is invoking the Emergency Act for a crisis that he created. He is attempting to use a tool at the government's disposal that was created with the intention of rarely, if ever, being used. This Prime Minister is using this last resort tool to clean up a crisis of his own creation. The Emergency Measures Act gave extraordinary powers to a government, powers that should only be used when every other effort has been exhausted. Enacting these measures should not be the first or second thing the Liberal government does to resolve a crisis. We have not seen any action by the Prime Minister to avoid jumping to this extreme measure. Madam Speaker, as a former police chief, I've had enough thorough experience in dealing with crisis situations and the de-escalation of such crises. The first step in de-escalation is not to bring in a sledgehammer. The Prime Minister could not even take the first step everyone should use in de-escalation. Madam Speaker, that step would be listening. The Prime Minister refused to meet with the protesters to listen to their concerns. These are his fellow Canadian citizens, whether he agrees with their opinions or not. He is the Prime Minister of Canada, and a good leader listens to his fellow countrymen. Madam Speaker, the Emergency Act specifically states part of the criteria for enactment is that all other measures have been exhausted in attempting to resolve the crisis. How can we possibly vote in favor of this act when the Prime Minister has not even attempted the most basic measure of resolving any crisis? Instead, the Prime Minister has inflamed the situation, almost if he wanted to get to this point. It is quite evident the Prime Minister is not capable of first steps in any crisis he faces. It is in his ideological identity to squash anyone who does not agree with him, and fortunately, Canadians of all walks of life know this all too well. Earlier this week, my Conservative colleagues proposed a possible step to end the crisis. We propose the government provide Canadians with their plan for ending the various federal COVID-19 related mandates and restrictions. This is an example of one of the many actions that was available to this government before deciding on this drastic measure. Providing Canadians with an end plan is not a controversial decision. Many of the provincial governments have already done the same. Many Canadians, including many participating in the various protests, would have welcomed this action as a sign the government is hearing the wish of Canadians for some direction or evidence of an end plan. Instead, this government jumped to ignore this measure of action and is all too eager to get to this extreme point that we see ourselves in today. While the Prime Minister has failed to present us evidence supporting the use of the Act, I can think of numerous examples when this country has faced a crisis and managed to come out of it without implementing the Act. Just last week, we saw these protests at several Canadian-U.S. border crossings. These protests created grave economic consequences for the country, including my riding of Oxford. As Oxford has strong ties to the automotive manufacturing section, I had firsthand account of the consequences of the protest in Windsor. Many automotive manufacturing plants had to slow down or even completely shut off production. My office received numerous messages from constituents who were being laid off due to these shutdowns. The Windsor border blockade was a crisis for many of my constituents. What did not cross my mind or theirs, that the Emergency Act would need to be invoked to solve the crisis, and in fact, it was not. We saw officers peacefully remove the blockade to allow the border to reopen. They did this without the use of the Emergency Act. A similar situation occurred in Coutts, Alberta. Again, RCMP officers were able to clear the blockade without any tools from the Emergency Act. There have been numerous examples throughout Canadian history when a crisis such as this one, or I may say worse than this one, have arose, many of them being of much more dangerous nature than the current situation. Another that comes to mind is the crisis we all saw with the 210 G20 riots in Toronto. Some members of the government would be very familiar with this crisis. The Minister of Emergency Preparedness especially so, as he was the Toronto Police Chief at the time. Maybe some forget what we saw during that crisis. We saw a bank just down the street from Parliament being firebombed. We saw police cars in flames downtown Toronto, and we saw hundreds of businesses damaged by protesters. Madam Speaker, the Emergency Act was available to our government at the time. It was not used in that crisis. Why? Because it did not meet the criteria as outlined in the Emergency Act. Flaming vehicles and destroyed businesses. That's what the Minister of Emergency Preparedness, the acting Toronto Police Chief, was facing at the time. Madam Speaker, if flaming banks and police cars do not constitute a reason for using the Emergency Act, I find it very hard to see how road hockey games, bouncy castles do. The Minister of Emergency Preparedness knows very well that the police officers we have here have all the tools necessary to fuse this situation if needed. They did not need the Emergency Act in Windsor or Coutts, Alberta. Instead, the Minister of Emergency Preparedness said he was proud to invoke this act. I find it extremely disappointing to hear this coming from a fellow former police chief. No one in this House should be proud to use this act. However, it seems the Prime Minister is all too eager to use it. Another similar crisis again occurring during the Minister of Emergency occurred a year before the G20 summit. In 2009, we saw many Tamil Canadians upset with what they were seeing happening in the Sri Lankan Civil War. These Canadians shut down north and southbound lanes of University Avenue, Toronto for 4 days. They blocked the U.S. consulate in Toronto, and they illegally blocked traffic on the Gardiner Expressway. Again, it was not necessary to invoke the Emergency Act. In fact, use of force by police officers was not necessary. And I must say, the Toronto Police Chief, the current Minister of Emergency Preparedness, used his training in community policing to help facilitate a peaceful end to the crisis. The Chief even received an award from the Tamil Canadian community for his leadership during this process. Madam Speaker, again, I fail to see why the government sees it's necessary to invoke the Emergency Act now when it was not necessary in 2010 or even last week. Why were we able to see those crises resolved with such extreme measures? We have several precedents for why this Emergency Act should not be invoked. We have no reasons why it should be. Yet here we are in this debate. Madam Speaker, let's talk about a time when the government had to enact similar crisis. That was during the October crisis in 1970. While it was a different act, the War Measures Act, it did possess many similar properties to today's act. Madam Speaker, it is important to compare the crisis of that time to what we are seeing now. In the lead up to the October crisis, we saw an terrorist organization robbing and bombing several institutions in Quebec, robbing and bombing, Madam Speaker. That is the crisis that reached a climax with several kidnappings and eventually the horrendous murder of Quebec Cabinet Minister Pierre Laporte. That was the context of the last time a Canadian government used such drastic actions to restore order. I don't think it should take much effort to realize that while many may be experiencing a crisis of our own, it pales in comparison to what the government of the day faced the last time an Emergency Act was implemented. Invoking the Emergency Act now for the purpose of trying to cover up the mismanagement and poor leadership of this Liberal government would be creating a dangerous precedent for any future crisis the government may face. What is to stop this government from implementing this act every time they have a group of fellow Canadians who disagree? Madam Speaker, we have heard members of the government tell us the Emergency Act is necessary to dismantle this illegal protests and blockades. I again ask, how was it possible the illegal protests and blockades in Windsor and Coutts were dismantled if they did not possess the required tools? Furthermore, the Act states the nature of the emergency is one that seriously endangers the lives of Canadians. Madam Speaker, if we're in such grave danger from these protesters, such those in Ottawa, why would members of the House even have been allowed to convene in the House? The threshold for this act has not been made. Thank you. Madam Speaker, we have heard the Minister of Justice brag about how the mere mention of using the Emergency Act resulted in protesters in Coutts, Alberta dispersing from their blockade. The Minister was bragging about using the most powerful tool available to this government. He should be ashamed that it has come to this point. He should be ashamed because it means the government has failed miserably. Madam Speaker, I think all Canadians should be ashamed that the Prime Minister has failed Canadians. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Guelph.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member from Oxford for his intervention today. He's the member representing my son-in-law's riding, and I know that he works well on behalf of his community. But in this case, Madam Speaker, where we've invoked the Emergency Act so that police have additional tools as needed, tools such as stopping parents from using their children as human shields in the course of protests. And by using that act or having the act in place so that children's aid could be used to protect children that are vulnerable in terms of danger in these situations, The Act is there for the use of police forces to use as needed. And our police forces showed incredible restraint throughout this whole occupation of Ottawa. And now we see the borders in British Columbia being blockaded. So the Act is there to be used where needed, as needed, for the time of the period of time that they are needed. Could the member comment on the judicious use of the Act, that we give the tools to police forces, but the police forces use them as needed?
A member for Oxford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm glad that the member's son-in-law found a great place to live with a good member of Parliament. But having said that, I am concerned that the Liberals are using this Act as a sledgehammer. I've worked with police officers across this country, and I know that in Windsor, for instance, they were able to clear that with the help of the RCMP and the OPP. They existed before this Act came in. What we're seeing happen in Alberta and across the country is Canadians that are thoroughly upset with the Prime Minister, who doesn't listen and just doesn't pay attention.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Montcalm. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like my colleague from Oxford to tell me what he thinks about the fact that in listening to the Liberals speak on the other side, we get the impression that you need to invoke the use of the Emergencies Act to coordinate the police forces to justify the use of this Emergencies Act, when the criteria are much more important and restrictive. Because if it's needed for coordination, then perhaps they're going to use this kind of proclamation again. The Honourable Member from Oxford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, it would take a lot longer than I have to tell him what I think about it. But having said that, you know, for years and years, police departments and police officers have worked in coordinated fashion in a whole variety of things. This was all brought about through poor planning on behalf of a variety of agencies, which we'll hear about, I'm sure, as this goes on. But more importantly, it is an act that didn't need to be invoked. All of the things that people are taking credit for could have been done with civil law that we already had. Seizing bank accounts from people. I've already heard from people here that gave minimal amounts of money to what they believe to be legal entities have now had their bank accounts seized. And that just doesn't seem right in Canada.
Brief question, the Honourable Member for Nunavut.
I'd like to ask the member if he has reviewed the emergency measures regulations, section 1A to F, and if he's looked at the places that are to be protected, and if he has not seen the dangers that have been placed in those places.
I have not read that part of the Act, or I couldn't repeat it back to you, but there's so many things in the Act that are dangerous to, you know, law-abiding Canadians that have now run afoul. And when I heard the member, the parliamentary secretary from Sudbury, say that he supported them when they were in his community before it turned to be an unlawful situation, I could only think, I hope that he doesn't have his bank account seized too.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Tobic-Mactaquac.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in this, the People's House, today with both heaviness of heart and hope for the future. My heart is heavy with all that I am hearing from people from my riding and Canadians from coast to coast to coast, for that matter. I, along with so many of them, are gravely concerned with the gargantuan overreach this Prime Minister has made with the invoking of the Emergencies Act, granting him and this government with unprecedented and unnecessary powers with which to deal with the challenge that is before us. 7 out of 10 provinces have expressed huge concerns regarding its implementation and the dangerous precedent that it sets as it relates to the suppression of individual rights and freedoms of Canadian citizens. The fact that the blockades in Alberta, in Manitoba, and here in Ontario at the Windsor Bridge tells us that they were all resolved peacefully under and utilizing existing laws. They never needed to implement or utilize the extreme measures of the Emergency Measures Act, which was known previously as the War Measures Act, and only utilized on 3 previous occasions: World War I, World War II, and the FLQ situation. The weaponization of this extreme measure against political opponents, even to the extent of freezing their assets and threatening their livelihoods, is both draconian, authoritarian, and deeply concerning. It is just plain wrong, Madam Speaker, and I will be voting to revoke it and encourage all my fellow parliamentarians to do the same. While reflecting in preparation for these remarks today, I was reminded, Madam Speaker, of a leadership conference that I had the privilege of attending around 20 years ago, at which the keynote speaker shared a story that deeply impacted my life and influenced even my role now, currently, as a member of Parliament. I'll never forget what the keynote speaker shared with us that evening. He was sharing about a king and his messenger, his apprentice. A king wanted to get a very important message through to a certain community, to an area and region in his kingdom. He wanted them to hear it clearly, and he wanted them to understand it. And it had severe ramifications. The messenger was hesitant, in fact, was resistant, and did not like or want to participate or go to share that message. But the king said implicitly to the messenger, I want you to go, and for 7 days, I want you to go visit that community, sit amongst the people, hear their stories, observe their customs, and don't open your mouth for 7 days. Then after 7 days, I will give you the message that they need to hear. But until the 7 days is up, do not speak. He applied that principle, the keynote speaker did, to all of us as leaders or aspiring leaders. That before we as leaders rush in with fast answers and quick solutions and grab the megaphone to speak, we must first take the time to listen and sit where those people that we're communicating with sit and hear their stories, hear their perspectives. Whether we agree with them or not, whether we embrace all aspects of what they may be doing or not, we need to have the courtesy and the decency to at least hear what they are saying. And he said once the messenger had done that, then he communicated what he was supposed to communicate. The situation was resolved, and the message was received. But he did it from a place of identification. The messenger did it from a place of having sat where they sat and heard their stories and understood where they were coming from, even though he didn't agree or even share many of the beliefs that those with whom he was communicating had. Could it be that there's an application for all of us that are in this house today and for the Prime Minister himself? How different things could have been had our Prime Minister taken the time to listen, to engage, and to hear what people were saying from coast to coast to coast. Rather than engage, he chose rather to enrage, and he went to escalating rather than de-escalating. How much of this situation could be different, and how much could have potentially been resolved had the Prime Minister taken the time to hear the concerns of Canadian citizens? The last 2 years of dealing with COVID has not been easy. It has brought many frustrations with it from coast to coast. Canadians are weary and they're tired. It's been exhausting. And rather than escalation, they were looking for their leaders to bring a sense of peace and calming reassurance. But where do we find ourselves right now? We find ourselves at a heightened state of tension, where jurisdictions around the world are de-escalating, where jurisdictions around the world are loosening up restrictions, lifting mandates, allowing people to get their lives back and moving on. This Prime Minister has chosen rather to use accusation, hurl insults, name call, castigate, and ridicule. Would not a different approach serve all of us well? Canadians are looking to us, and they're wondering, are you, as elected officials, hearing what we're saying? Are you hearing what we've been telling you? I know in preparation for this role as a member of Parliament, and I know many of you have done the same, we knocked on thousands of doors. We sat at tables. We took phone calls. We've responded to emails. We took the time to hear the concerns of those that we desire to represent. And whether it's at the kitchen table of a nurse who's exhausted from long overtime hours and time away from her family, or whether it's been in the farmer's field with a farmer who's kept doing what they knew to do even throughout the time of crisis when the rest of the world shut down, they kept growing and producing. Perhaps you've sat at the tables with a senior who's lonely and isolated and hasn't been able to see their grandkids in a long time. Perhaps you've heard the stories of someone who's lost employment and their business went under because of the elongated restrictions and rolling lockdowns. Perhaps you've heard the story of the concerns of the mill owners wondering if they can keep operating in these circumstances. Perhaps you also have heard the concerns of parents who are concerned about the increased levels of depression and anxiety that their children are facing. Perhaps you have heard the same concerns I've heard. They want their lives back. They want their country back. They want the Canada that we all love and cherish back. They're not recognizing the Canada that they're seeing before them displayed on their televisions right now. They're not comfortable with the anger from all sides. Canadians are looking for leaders who will listen to their cry. They're tired of the extremes on all sides. They're tired of the us versus them. They're tired of the Facebook wars and the social media conflicts. They're tired of family member being pitted against family member, Canadian against Canadian, and they are exhausted with the continual polarization. Canadians are speaking loudly and they're speaking clearly, and Madam Speaker, I conclude with this. I have reason for hope today because we have heard their voices. And I cling to an old promise from an ancient scripture that says, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. I wish COVID-19 had not lasted 2 years and only was 12 hours. But as sure as night has come, and we sense the heaviness upon all of us, morning will break in this country. And people will once again be able to embrace a government that hears their concerns and responds to it and chooses not to use the nuclear option of suppressing their rights and freedoms at a time when it's not needed, and they're looking for de-escalation. On this side of the House, we hear you. On this side of the House, we'll bring your concerns forward. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. A year ago, we saw Alberta lift its restrictions for the best summer ever, and it wasn't. Albertans suffered. The hospitals were overrun. Albertans died that didn't need to die. But this is the same message that we're hearing from the protesters, at least some of them, purportedly, the ones that aren't trying to overthrow the government. Would the honourable member believe that it's best that we have not politicians making decisions to lift mandates, but politicians backstopped with good, wise, sage public health advice?
Or Tobic Mactaquac.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thanks to the honourable member. I want to say this, that actually the science is very clear, and the science is recommending that mandates begin to be lifted, that restrictions begin to be lifted. The science, there was a recent study by Johns Hopkins University that's been peer-reviewed. It said very clearly that the lockdowns have been having more harm than they are good, especially when you compare it to the socio and economic impacts that these lockdowns are having. When you look at the mental health costs, you look at the strains, the increased rates of anxiety and depression, the science is clear. And jurisdictions like the UK, Ireland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, France, Spain, they're all moving in this direction. 39 of 50 US states. They're all telling us it's time to learn how to live with this and move on. And that, Madam Speaker, is what we should be doing and any responsible government should be doing.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi, Bay James, Nunavik, EU. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I would like to thank my colleague for his speech. From what I've understood, based on what he said, that we know very well everything that's gone on in Ottawa over the last 3 weeks and the effect it's had on the people there, on businesses, on enterprises, and really across Canada as well, and even in Quebec. You said earlier that, yes, we're speaking of protests. Protests are acceptable, but there are limits. One must not become an extremist. So I would like to know why he really does object to invoking the Emergencies Act, given that nothing has been done for 3 weeks before that. You must put all questions through the Speaker and not speak directly to your colleagues.
Merci à mon collègue pour votre question. C'était très important et j'apprécie ça beaucoup. Madam Chair, I would just like to say I'd like to thank the honourable member for her question. And yes, there are extreme elements on all sides that I believe Canadians want us to make sure are dealt with appropriately and dealt with through utilizing the existing laws that are already in place. We saw this happen across the country. They've been utilized, they've been effective without using the nuclear option of going to this extreme measure where now this act is being weaponized against Canadian citizens who happen to not share the same political views as the current government. That is a dangerous precedent. So I think what we need is a measured response, a reasonable response, so that the hallmark of any democracy's right to protest is protected while done lawfully and peacefully as all Canadians desire. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
For a brief question, the honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Congress has launched an investigation into Facebook and how bot farm accounts in Romania, Vietnam, Bangladesh were tied to the Freedom Convoy. One stolen account accounted for millions of dollars raised, 340,000 signed up in 2 days. I'm asking why Parliament has not agreed to look into Russian disinformation in the driving of the convoy when Congress has stepped up with a serious investigation in how the bot farms and extremist content was driven from outside of Canada against Canadians.
For Tobic Mactaquac.
My honourable colleague for his question. I think right now that obviously we already have tools and mechanisms in place to make sure that safeguards are in place for foreign donors and others who are involving themselves in Canadian affairs, like FinTrack. Let's utilize the tools that are already in place rather than this nuclear overreach and taking and targeting Canadian citizens for their actions that may be opposed politically to the government of the day. This is a dangerous overreach, Madam Speaker, and this measure must be revoked by this Parliament.
Reprise de débat. Resuming debate. L'honorable député de Laurentides.
The honourable member for Laurentides-Labelle. Thank you, Madam Speaker. At the outset, I would like to share my time with my respected colleague from Abitibi, Bay James, Nunavut, EU. Madam Speaker, on this day in which we're debating this Emergencies Act, I would like to first say thank you to everyone working here, the cooks, the interpreters, the pages, as well as journalists and their teams who have covered so many events. Of course, I'm fully aware that the current circumstances are exceptional. I hope that all parliamentarians, especially those in government, are fully aware of this as well. A vote will be held in a few hours' time. It may set an important precedent. It has been a busy few days. We've been busy debating non-essential legislation to lift a siege of Ottawa. We've been busy discussing with our citizens, with those of Laurentides-Labelle, the issues at stake. Hundreds of you have shared your concerns and wishes regarding the blockade, which unfortunately lasted for 23 days. I would like to take this opportunity to explain the ins and outs of our opposition to the Emergencies Act, which the government invoked suddenly without having demonstrated that other legislative tools available to it had not sufficed to deal with the situation. Obviously, I understand you're being totally fed up with the virus, health measures, rules that have changed our lives. I, too, have been directly affected. So I acknowledge you, caregivers, entrepreneurs, parents, healthcare workers, and so many others. As you already know, we will vote against the invocation of the Emergencies Act for several reasons. What did our elected representatives in the Quebec National Assembly unanimously support on February 15th? A motion stating that there is no emergency currently justifying the use of special legislative measures in Quebec, and asking that the Canadian government not apply the Emergencies Act on Quebec territory. Could we please respect the will of the 125 members of the National Assembly? What's even more absurd is that 7 out of 10 provinces are also against invoking this law, while of course Ontario is calling for it because this is where the siege took place. The invocation of this sort of law is not to be taken lightly. It must be used in a measured and proportionate manner. The Prime Minister himself has said on several occasions that it won't be used where it is not needed. So why is he applying it everywhere? The Prime Minister also explained in the House and in documents that he feared that other roadblocks would be thrown up elsewhere in Canada, especially given the mobilizing effects of social networks. However, such a law isn't something you invoke just in case. It must be invoked solely to deal with a real imminent situation. And the law must be indispensable and necessary. Between you and me, Madam Speaker, given all that has taken place in recent days, the legislative tools needed were already available in the criminal code. The arrests were carried out in conjunction with various police forces. In my opinion, this should have taken place within the first few days. But we had no head of state able to coordinate the action needed. Sadly, I have not, since I've been elected, seen the statesman whom we need. Instead of intervening upstream during a crisis, an issue, or even a pandemic, the Prime Minister has been escalating conflicts of interest. I've seen that in committees. The federal government dragged its feet, even as the City of Ottawa called for reinforcements. The situation can be summed up as follows. The federal government tried absolutely nothing, then, no longer knowing what to do, invoked the Emergencies Act, just as all the occupations were being dismantled. The authorities will continue their work. Imagine, the government only became concerned about the situation on the Ambassador Bridge after receiving a call from the White House. That's quite something, isn't it? The government, however, did hear the call from the Ottawa Police, but long before reacting. The OPS called for 1,800 more officers, but the feds only sent a handful, mainly to protect ministers and parliamentarians. Only 20 were assigned to the protests. Now, you should also know that in order to invoke the Emergencies Act, the government must demonstrate 2 things. First, there exists an urgent and dangerous situation. 2, that cannot be dealt with under ordinary laws. Yes, there is an urgent and dangerous situation, but this situation is confined to Ontario. We want this to apply only where there is or was an occupation, especially since the use of this law, if deployed more broadly than it should, would set a dangerous precedent. It was not necessary to resort to the Emergencies Act to deal with the railway blockades of 2020, the uncut crisis, the events of 9/11, even the pandemic itself, COVID-19. Let me be clear. When we're criticized for not having taken action, we all do our best to have others overlook our clumsiness. We often use overwhelming, excessive means to sort of stun them, showing them that we're strong. except that politics is not a game where we can strategize merely to hold onto or regain power. If that observation seems cynical and saddens you, well, as we say from where I come, welcome to the club. But to apply emergency legislation to a situation that's limited to one place and is not seen across Canada, that's overkill. What saddens me, Madam Speaker, is that voters will think the Prime Minister of Canada saved Ottawa. To you, police officers at all levels, please accept my sincere gratitude for the tremendous work you've done. So, to all those who've asked me about the invocation of the Emergencies Act, I say yes, the siege had to end. But the measures already in effect saved Ottawa. It was the criminal code and the highway traffic code that saved Ottawa. Will I vote for this law? No. All of Quebec's elected officials do not want it, all 125 of them. The implications of this Emergencies Act are too important to use it to regain control after a government has remained passive and lacked leadership. Remember, most of the steps taken to manage the pandemic were largely following in line with provincial health measures. We need only remember the management, or rather the lack of management, of the borders from the very outset of the pandemic. The Prime Minister had a great opportunity to show his leadership as a statesman, but he did not do so. Too bad for him, too bad for all of us. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
For Peterborough, Kawatha.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Merci to my colleague, and I will one day have good enough French to ask the member in French. I'm curious if my colleague thinks that the Emergencies Act should be revoked now that the streets of Wellington are clear and there's nothing further blocking the streets.
The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I'm looking forward to this because I'm looking forward to speaking French with my colleague. But to answer the question, we've just had the demonstration thereof. So right off, the authorities showed the dismantling of the protest. We agreed on a strategy that could have been carried out in the first few days of the blockade. The authorities managed to undo other blockades. So is it because of the Emergencies Act that's been invoked now? No, is the answer. The Honourable Member for Montcalm. Thank you, Madam Speaker. According to some constitutional authorities, it's not sufficient that the act be useful to be enacted, to be proclaimed. It has to be demonstrated that it is necessary and indispensable. And does my colleague not think that this demonstration will be very difficult to carry out? In fact, impossible? Because we watched this situation deteriorate over 3 weeks, and at the same time, we didn't use all of the legal instruments we had already in hand to deal with this matter. The member for Laurentides-Labelle. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague from Montcalm for that very relevant question. Indeed, where is the demonstration? When we table such a legislation, it's because there is an emergency and there is danger. There is public health that is at risk in the country. And in the demonstration I made in my speech, there were so many occurrences that had a huger impact on our society. So how is it that for all those days where not much happened, it's suddenly decided that the big sledgehammer has to come out? Because indeed, 3 weeks was too long. So indeed, this act should not be invoked at this point.
House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. You know, I find the position of the Bloc Québécois to be quite interesting. You know, here is a party that I know is only voting against this because of the implications that it will have politically on them from the perspective of a national government, the national government coming in and superseding provincial territories, despite the fact they're shaking their head. I know they have a big problem with that. But, you know, the Bloc Québécois didn't seem to have a problem with it when the Quebec government asked the federal military to come in and help with long-term care at the beginning of the pandemic. You know, why was it okay for the federal government to be an active partner with Quebec to help secure and fix the long-term care problem, but when it comes to something like this, the Bloc Québécois is totally against it?
Great question. The honourable member for Laurentides-Labelle. Well, in fact, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question, but we have to put things into perspective. At the moment, and I think we also have to understand the role of the Bloc Québécois, we have always said that what's important for us is what's good for Quebec, we will be in favor of. So currently, the National Assembly in Quebec voted unanimously against this. Why? Because it's limited to what's happening in the national capital of Canada. So right at the outset, it's really important to respect the voice of elected members and the seven other provinces. So what happened in the long-term care homes is a completely different issue. And I don't accept that there can be a comparison made.
Conversations to please take them out in the lobby. Whether someone is physically in the House or virtually, they still deserve the respect of the House. Reprise de débat.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Abitibi, Bay James, Nunavik, EU. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I wish to thank my colleague from Laurentides-Labelle for her speech. I wish to inform you, I would like to begin my speech rather by acknowledging the excellent work of the police forces, whose professionalism and actions are beyond reproach. I would be remiss if I also did not salute the work of the security officers on Parliament Hill, who ensured our protection during the siege in front of Parliament. Thanks to you, we are able to come out here every day and do our work safely. And we must recognize the exceptional work of all the staff on Parliament Hill and the journalists who cover the news under difficult conditions. Honestly, Madam Speaker, I would have preferred to speak on more important and less trivial matters than this one today. Why? Do I need to remind you that we are in a pandemic? That many Aboriginal communities do not have access to drinking water, that seniors do not manage to make ends meet each month and must make choices between buying food or medication, that it is essential that the federal government increase health transfers without conditions to cover 35% of health care costs, as Quebec and the provinces are unanimously demanding. I could go on and on, Madam Speaker, because the list is long. To be entitled to invoke the Emergencies Act, the government must demonstrate two things. One, that there is a dangerous and urgent situation, and two, that it cannot be dealt with by what might be called ordinary laws. And yet, all the blockades we have seen across Canada in the last few weeks have been dismantled one by one without the use of the Emergencies Act. Do we need the Emergencies Act? Did we need it to remove the blockade at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor? No. Did we need the Emergencies Act to remove the blockade in Sarnia? No. Did we need the Emergencies Act for the demonstration at the entrance of the Peace Bridge in Fort Erie? No. And did we need the Emergencies Act to break up the blockade in Emerson, in Manitoba? No. Did we need the Emergencies Act to deal with the protests in Metro Vancouver? No. Did the police successfully dismantle the siege here in Ottawa without the Emergencies Act? Yes. The government, therefore, should never have brought this motion forward. It was not justified in light of current events and the good work of the police. At best, they should have withdrawn it as soon as they saw that the blockades were being dismantled without the use of this act. That would have given us time to debate more serious issues, such as those I mentioned at the beginning of my speech. As you know, several provinces did not want this act to be used on their territory, and this is the case for Quebec. The three opposition parties in the National Assembly joined forces with Premier Legault to express their disagreement with the application of the federal emergencies legislation in Quebec. Members from all parties in the National Assembly supported a motion to that effect. You know, some 50 years ago, the federal government used its extraordinary power, and we all know what happened. It's written history. The use of such an act is not to be taken lightly. Its application must be measured, proportionate, and justified. Why did the Prime Minister decide to apply it across the country? No listening on his part, since, as I said, several provinces, including Quebec, do not want it. Once again, no respect for the provinces and territories to make informed and justifiable decisions as a real head of state would. I will now explain to you, Madam Speaker, why we are here today to debate this motion. It's because we have a Prime Minister who, instead of acting like a real statesman worthy of the name, has been sitting there, I don't know where, with his arms crossed, waiting. But it's not as if we didn't know that this was coming. It wasn't a surprise. We saw it, and we knew it. We knew the protesters were coming to Ottawa. And don't get me wrong, Madam Speaker, people have the right to demonstrate. That's part of democracy. But they have to do it in accordance with the law. Instead of being proactive, the Prime Minister chose to remain inactive. Oh no, I forgot, at one point he had the good idea of throwing fuel on the fire by insulting the demonstrators. This is unacceptable behavior and not worthy of a real head of state. And because of his laxity, the people of Ottawa and the surrounding area have been living in hell for days on end, whether it be in terms of their safety, of the noise, or even of the traffic. Horns blaring day and night. I sympathize with the people who endured this for too long. Also, we mustn't forget the people who could not work during the siege. Businesses had to remain closed. People had to stay home. There were sacrifices made. Madam Speaker, will the government come to the assistance of these workers and business owners who have lost income in spite of themselves? Faced with the magnitude of this situation, having lost control and not knowing what to do, the Prime Minister thought it would be a good idea to use a big bazooka to kill a fly using the Emergencies Act. This was a dangerous decision, Madam Speaker. The use of the Emergencies Act is not appropriate in this case, and it would set a precedent. For days, I've been watching my Liberal colleagues skate around these issues. They're trying to justify the Prime Minister's decision with arguments that have so far not convinced me at all. I will still vote against the motion. Even the NDP said this weekend that they are no longer sure whether the Emergency Measures Act is appropriate. They're even thinking of doing an about-face and not voting with the Liberals. I wanted to say, Madam Speaker, that over the last 3 weeks, we've seen highs and lows with these demonstrations that should not have lasted so long. In conclusion, I would like to take the remainder of my time to thank everyone who works in healthcare. Thank you for all your efforts, for your courage during this pandemic, and doing a remarkable job. We appreciate everything. We salute the tremendous work that you do. And I would also like to salute the tremendous work of the organizations of Abitibi, St. Bay, St. James, Nunavut, who are and still doing a remarkable job during the pandemic. Finally, I want to thank the entire population of my riding. Your sacrifices, your understanding, and the application and respect of health standards made a big difference for us during the pandemic. Thanks to your efforts, we made it through 5 waves with a limited loss of loved ones. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for her speech. I would like to know whether my colleague would like to talk about the lack of leadership by the Prime Minister at this time, and also whether she would like to stop this act. The Honourable Member for Abitibi Bay James Nunavut. I want to thank my colleague for the question. We know that everything that had happened should have taken place in the first few days of the demonstrations in Ottawa. We think that the government did not act, did not cooperate with the police forces in Ottawa. We don't think that the Emergencies Act is necessary because the municipal bylaws, provincial laws are sufficient to manage the situation. We already saw it in Quebec. They did it properly there. I don't think this Emergencies Act is necessary. Thank you.
Comments? L'Honorable.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Again, I've been raising the issue of the Ambassador Bridge. The blockade there did require extensive supports, and the City of Windsor residents are on the hook for that right now. But currently, right now, the blockade has been moved to actually cut off the city streets, including a 300-year-old Francophonie community that has been very important for this community. It's also very impoverished. And lastly, Madam Speaker, the Ambassador Bridge is owned by a private American billionaire who now actually gets the benefit of actually the barricades funneling all the traffic to his coffers. I'd like the honourable member to understand and maybe perhaps reflect is that who should be paying for this? Is it the City of Windsor residents and the Francophonie culture from here, or should it actually be from the provincial and federal government? Because right now we're on the hook.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi Bay James Nunavut. We know that this legislation was invoked on Monday and it did nothing with regard to the Ambassador Bridge. They had already opened it to the police. The municipal police opened it, so the work wasn't done again. So it's not necessary to use this legislation to begin this process.
Parkford, Saskatchewan. The Honourable Member for Sherwood Parkford, Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sometimes there's a bit of a delay, I think, because of the translation, but thank you to the member for her speech. I'm very concerned about the phenomenon of discrimination on the basis of political views that we increasingly hear from the government. The Justice Minister talking about people's bank accounts being frozen on the basis of being part of an allegedly pro-Trump movement. In this country, as long as you are not involved in violence, you're able to hold whatever views you want, and that shouldn't be a factor when deciding whether individuals' bank accounts should be frozen. Many individuals donated to the convoy movement prior to the start of any blockading. I wonder if the member could share her thoughts on this phenomenon of discrimination on the basis of political views, how people are being treated differently, how protests are treated differently depending on the cause they're advocating, and what can we do as parliamentarians to address this problem?
The Honourable Member for Abitibi Bay James Nunavut. I want to thank my colleague for the question. As I indicated earlier, the provinces and the police are able to handle the situations when it came to demonstrations or people who do not cooperate with legislation. So I think what is important is to mention that there is already processes that exist and we need to respect them. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Parry Sound.
Muskoka.
Sorry, Parry Sound, Muskoka, yes.
Grant thy servant an understanding heart, that I may discern between good and evil. As I took my seat for the very first time in this House, the words of Solomon came to mind, seeking wisdom to lead. Here I was in this place, a place I had dreamt of many times, that maybe one day I would have the opportunity to sit in and represent my fellow citizens. Especially today, though, as I speak in this House about the chaos, the division, and the anger, not just in front of this place, but all across Canada, I hope for wisdom for myself and all my fellow members. Madam Speaker, leaders lead. They lead by inspiring those around them to greatness. They inspire a hope that tomorrow will be brighter than today. They lift everyone up, not just those who agree with them. They seek to bring people together, to give a voice to the voiceless, a seat at the table. Leaders stand up for every citizen, every Canadian, urban, rural, rich or poor, white collar, blue collar, right and left, regardless of their faith or creed, regardless of their place of origin. Leaders give every ounce of their being to ensure a legacy of prosperity and success for their fellow citizens. What we saw out front for the last 3 weeks was a failure of leadership. It was a failure of those entrusted by Canadians for that most solemn of tasks, to ensure that our kids will inherit a better future than we received, to ensure that the maple leaf is an undying symbol here and around the world of freedom, pluralism, justice, and democracy.
Hear, hear.
Madam Speaker, we're here today to talk about the Emergencies Act. I, like many of my colleagues in this House and millions of Canadians, believe that the use of this act at this time is a dramatic overreach. You've heard from many members here about the consequences if the bar is lowered even just a little bit in the future use of this act. I echo those concerns. The fact is, the protests had to end. Every Canadian has a right to peaceful protest, but we do not have a right to park a truck in the middle of a city street for 3 weeks. Just as we have a right to disagree with those who have chosen not to get vaccinated, but we don't have a right to call them racists or misogynists. I believed my doctor when he told me that vaccination is the best tool, not the only tool, but the best tool to protect my health and my neighbors against COVID-19. I also believed my doctor when he told me that when we reach 85 to 90% of vaccination rates, we should be able to start getting our lives back. And we see that starting to happen now. The fact is, Canada is among the most vaccinated countries on earth. And yet there are some of our fellow citizens who simply will not get vaccinated. We need to be okay with that. While I understand some of the reasons I have heard for vaccine hesitancy, I don't understand all of them. And I don't need to. I don't need to understand my fellow citizens' medical choices to defend their fundamental right to make those choices.
Hear, hear.
That's the beauty of this country. You get to make your own health choices. We don't impose draconian measures on the people we disagree with. And it's also why I echo the words of Pierre Elliott Trudeau when he said, "For if individuals and minorities do not feel protected against the possibility of the tyranny of the majority, it is useless to ask them to open their hearts and minds to their fellow Canadians." Madam Speaker, this debate should never have had to happen.
Exactly.
Truckers should never have had to park their trucks in front of Parliament. The divisive rhetoric and demonizing of a minority of Canadians by their own government, whatever the intention, was quite simply disgusting. This is clearly not the first time the political class has used our differences of opinion to divide us for political gain, and it likely will not be the last. We have stopped talking to each other. We're all guilty of it. We listen to our party war rooms on how the polls show us we can slice and dice the electorate to our advantage. We say we have a desire to listen to each other, and then we go on the partisan attack. And the actions we take right here in this House directly translate to how we treat each other as Canadians. I don't know if those of us who sit in the privilege of this place in our fancy suits surrounded by deferential security guards calling us sir and ma'am truly understand the anger and the frustrations. so many Canadians feel their hopes and their dreams slipping further and further away. They yearn for politicians to striving for a country where everyone has a place, where everyone has a shot at success. A country where we might not always agree on every issue, but we always agree that we live in the greatest country on the world, and that we deserve a government that is not all things to all people, Madam Speaker, but where we can all come together and no one gets left behind. This is a country where you can be anything you want to be and do anything you want to do. We can give a job to those without one. We can ensure our next generation can afford a home. We can eradicate poverty. We can come together again. We can break down the walls that divide us and help heal this broken nation, all with an understanding heart. And Mr. Speaker, it starts with all of us in this House. Canadians are counting on our leadership. My message to the Prime Minister and to every one of us in this House is simple. Listen to those you disagree with. Be willing to compromise. Let's work together to build on the common cause of bringing Canadians together, to celebrate all that unites us. And to everyone else, let's tone down the heat. Let's be open to hearing opinions other than our own, and let's try to see ourselves on the other side. This is Canada. We can disagree without hating each other. Madam Speaker, there is nothing wrong with Canada that cannot be fixed with everything that is right about Canada. Let's cut down the partisan personal attacks and ideological entrenchment. Let's start listening to each other and to our communities rather than the political operatives who use the differences between us to stoke fear and anger in the name of winning a few more votes. Let's hold each other to the same standards that Canadians hold their neighbors, which is to say, we should expect compassion, respect, courage, and character from one another. If we can do that, then we will start to bring this country back together again, because that's what leaders do. And Canada needs leaders right now. This is a critical time. We need only look south of the border to see the polarizing effects of a divisive political culture and culture war. Let us demand excellence from ourselves. Let us choose what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. Let us go forward together, building each other up, bringing Canadians from all walks of life together in the mutual cause of Canada, our beloved true north, strong and free. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Wow. Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Revenue.
Thank you, Madame la Présidente. And I just wish to say to the member from Parry Sound Muskoka, I really liked your speech today, and I liked the tone and the call for unity. And to be frank, I would have expected nothing less from having, in the last few months, gotten to know this member of Parliament, who I know represented his constituents now, not only at the federal level, but also municipal, and who I count as a friend, both today as a parliamentarian and in the future when I may not be in this House, hopefully in about 10 or 15 years. So with that, I do, he quoted Lincoln, and that obviously gives me utmost respect, and anybody knows about history. But I will ask this member, we are having a debate on the Emergencies Act, and it is time limited, it is proportionate, it has gotten the job done, and I wanted to get this member's view on that. Thank you, Madame la Présidente.
Honourable Member for Parry Sound Muskoka.
Well, I want to thank my colleague for this gracious comments and kind words, and the feeling is certainly quite mutual. I think that very specifically in this moment, I think it is an overreach. But I think you heard from me that what concerns me more than anything else is decades of a political discourse in this country that is designed to divide us. And all parties are guilty of it. And I'll say to anyone who served in municipal politics, if we ever behaved in municipal politics the way we behave in this House, we wouldn't be in office very long. It's disgusting. And it's ripping this country apart. And it breaks my heart. And we need to do better. So thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Montcalm. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The proclamation of the Emergencies Act is the last act that the executive power can impose out of respect for the representatives of the legislative power, that is us. Could my colleague, or does my colleague not think that given the gravity of the situation and what is at stake, that there should be a free vote on this issue?
Member for Parry Sound Muskoka.
Well, I thank my colleague for the question, and I'll admit to being surprised. I wasn't expecting that, but I think that it absolutely should be. I think that there should be more free votes in this place, frankly, and so I would just simply say yes, I agree.
Hear, hear.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I truly want to thank the honourable member across for his honest and heartfelt remarks in this House. We've heard a lot of rhetoric here over the last few days, and I know that I've certainly been impacted by it, exhausted at the end of the day, taken down by it. Often a former leader of the NDP has been named in this House and used against us in that division and divide, and so I want to thank him for quoting Jack Layton just now in terms of saying that Canada needs to be a place where no one is left behind, and that provides me with a lot of hope. And I agree that this is beyond something of just vaccine mandates, that this is about economic divisions that we have in our country, and the fact that people are terrified that they don't know where or how they're going to pay for the food that they need to for their kids or their mortgage. So I simply want to say to him that I stand ready to work with him to make this a better place for Canada, and I hope that we can continue to work together in that fashion. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Member for Parry Sound Muskoka has 1 minute to respond.
I probably don't need a minute, but I want to thank my colleague for the comments, and I think that's the kind of message that Canadians need to hear more of is those of us on all sides of this House seeking to work together. And I admit I had an exchange just last night in the lobbies with the member for Edmonton Strathcona, and it got heated, and I realized that I was guilty of arguing with her in the same way that I was about to speak today, and I regretted it. And I exchanged an email with her this morning to apologize for that, because it's easy to get caught up in the passions of this place. But we need to be constantly checking ourselves to know that we're not here for our own passions. We're here to represent people who need us to be here for them. So, thank you for that.
Amen.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kenora.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my friend and colleague and seatmate from Parry Sound Muskoka for his great speech. It's unfortunate that I have to follow him, because I know it's definitely a tough act to follow, but I appreciate that I can follow him, because I do share a lot of the same concerns as he does, and I truly am, Madam Speaker, concerned with the state of affairs in this country, in this place, in this chamber, and I'm worried about the direction that our political discussion is going. And I'd like to touch on that a bit more later on, Madam Speaker. But to start my remarks, I would like to come back to the issue at hand. And obviously, we have a very important vote tonight. And I believe I have a duty to share my views on how I will be making my decision when the vote comes tonight. Madam Speaker, as I said last week in this chamber, the blockades we are seeing are illegal. They must come to an end. I'm pleased to see that they have come to an end. The right to peaceful protest is an integral part of our democracy. It's an important pillar of our democracy. I've told many people back home that almost every day I'm here, it seems like there's a different protest happening out by the flame on the lawn of Parliament. And that's an important part of our process. However, nobody in this country has the right to blockade critical infrastructure. Freedom is limited by how it interferes with the freedom of others. And that is what we saw on display over the past few weeks here in Ottawa and in other places across the country. However, I believe, Madam Speaker, that police have the ability and had the ability to handle the situation without invoking the Emergencies Act. We saw that the Ambassador Bridge was cleared, that the Coutts border crossing was cleared without the invocation of the Emergencies Act. We also know in the past in this country, Madam Speaker, we've seen terrorist attacks, we've seen the Oka crisis, the Wet'suwet'en blockades, the fisheries crisis, G20 protests, the Stanley Cup riots in Vancouver, Madam Speaker. None of these instances warranted the use of the Emergencies Act. Quite recently, currently, we've seen the terrible images from BC, from the Coastal GasLink assault, a situation where the Emergencies Act is not deemed to be necessary. And I believe that the government had many options that they could take in working with their partners to address the situation without going so far, because there are such far-reaching powers afforded to the government by invoking this act, including the ability to freeze bank accounts of Canadians. Many people I know are very concerned that they may have contributed a small amount to support this convoy. They may have bought a shirt or contributed in a very small way, because they felt at the time that this convoy, this protest was going to be peaceful, that it was going to raise awareness about an issue that they cared about, and they felt like they did not have a voice raising that for them. And these people, those people, are the ones that I worry could be unfairly impacted by this decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. People that contributed not knowing that there would be unlawful protests, not knowing how the situation would escalate, or necessarily who was organizing it. And I also worry, as many have mentioned in this chamber already, throughout the weekend and here today already, I worry about the precedent that this sets. I believe we are drastically lowering the bar, Madam Speaker, for what constitutes an emergency in this country. And that's something that I think all of us in this chamber have to think very hard about when we have our vote here tonight. We do not want to see widespread use of the Emergencies Act. We do not want this to become something that is almost an everyday reaction because of how serious and far-reaching the powers are. And that's why I'll be voting against the implementation of the Emergencies Act. And, well, Madam Speaker, I mean, it'd be interesting to see, actually, how this vote transpires, because I think an argument could be made that the situation in which the government needed to address has actually been dealt with already. And I know that that's a question that's been put to the members of the government so far. But, Madam Speaker, as I mentioned off the top, Madam Speaker, I did want to pick up on some of the comments that my friend from Parry Sound Muskoka was making. because the rhetoric I've seen for weeks in question period, I'm truly disturbed by it, and I've been disgusted by it, Madam Speaker. The polarization that we're seeing across the country, the polarization that we're seeing in this chamber, needs to stop. Last week, the Prime Minister accused our side of standing with people who wave swastikas. Many members of this House have made comments to essentially say that we're racists, Madam Speaker, which of course cannot be further from the truth, but they're seeing a political opportunity, and that's what bothers me the most about this, Madam Speaker, because I know these members. These are my colleagues. These are my friends. I know that it doesn't seem like it to many people watching at home, but we actually do get along sometimes in this place, especially when we get outside of the chamber doors. Many members of the government, of the NDP, of other parties, I have coffee with them. I have dinner with them. You know, we crack jokes at the committee table. You know, after a particularly tough debate, maybe we have a drink that's a bit stiffer, Madam Speaker. But to think that those individuals view me and my colleagues as racists, I cannot accept. Because I surely know that if I believed anybody in this chamber was a racist, if I truly believed that, I would not be having dinner with them. I would not be shaking their hand.
Hear, hear.
Frankly, I don't think I would treat them with any respect whatsoever. And that's the frustrating part here, because I know it has become political. They see an opportunity to divide and to wedge, and they're capitalizing on it. And Madam Speaker, we have also heard from members of the government that their leadership has made, in the course of the last election campaign and since, a deliberate decision to stigmatize unvaccinated Canadians, driving wedges even further. But I don't mean to throw this all on the government. I obviously believe the Prime Minister has an important leadership role to play right now. We need the leader of our country to lead by example and work to unify us. But we all have to look inward in this place. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Because we're seeing hateful rhetoric on all sides. We are seeing people accusing the Prime Minister of being a communist dictator, which of course is ridiculous and untrue. We are seeing hate and polarization all across this chamber and all across this country. And putting an end to it starts right here, with every single one of us in this House. We need to tone down the heat. We need to tone down the rhetoric, as my friend before me mentioned. Madam Speaker, I'm shocked that I have to say this in this House. I mean, we have a Prime Minister who was democratically elected 3 times, who commands the confidence of this chamber. Yet there are many people across the country who are not seeing it as legitimate. And that is a very big problem in our democracy. I disagree with the use of the Emergencies Act. I believe it is far-reaching, but it does not make the Prime Minister a dictator. He is within his right to invoke it. So, Madam Speaker, my plea to all of my colleagues is to think about the words we use in this place. We cannot throw around words like dictator and racist flippantly. These words matter. They carry weight. And when we use these words so casually, I think we delegitimize the true evils that have been experienced by many people and continue to be experienced by many people in the world. So I'm asking all of my colleagues to look at their comments, look at their rhetoric, and reassess, because we are seeing divisions that are being created that I don't know how we come back from at this point, Madam Speaker. So I'm urging all my colleagues to tone down the rhetoric and work to unify. Not unify in the sense that we all agree on everything. We never will, nor should we. But let's have a respectable debate about the issues, and surely we do not need to resort to name-calling and personal attacks. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Guelph.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member for his intervention today and for his colleague beside him. I look forward to having breakfast again when the restaurant's open. We've had some really good discussions over over bacon and eggs in the morning, and I'm sure we'll have more to come when we're allowed to get back into the restaurants because of the health concerns being lifted. For the honourable member, my question is, when the emergency powers have been granted to police forces, but we've seen the police forces are working within their own governance, that they are not going into the streets and exercising full powers, but just the powers that are needed to restore law and order. And as we see borders again being put under siege out on the West Coast, that we still do need the Emergencies Act so that police forces can use their discretion in using the powers that they have, as they always do in a professional way. Not always, but hopefully they always do in the professional way that they are entitled to. So could the honourable member comment on having the power available, but that it's very important that we have oversight?
I have to give the honourable member for Kenora a chance to comment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the comments and the question from the member, and I want to thank him for buying breakfast in the last opportunity that we had. You know, as a true fiscal conservative, it was great for him to offer that to me, Madam Speaker. But you know, again, I have to go back to my comments at the front end of my speech, Madam Speaker. I do believe that law enforcement had the tools to deal with this situation outside of the Emergencies Act. I believe that, you know, what we have seen many protests throughout our country's history. We've seen crowd control be necessary in a number of situations. So I would have, of course, liked to see the government look to other options to support policing. As the Prime Minister has said, the Emergencies Act should not be the first or second or third resort. It remains unclear on this side of the House, at least, what those first, second, and third resorts were, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Berthier-Masquinongé. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I sincerely thank the member from Kenora for his speech and for the meaning of it. I really salute you, sir. And I invite all members of this chamber to take a moment to note the effect of the tone of what he has said to us here. This is the type of discourse we should hear at all times in this chamber. And I hope that this is what we're moving toward. Now, my colleague mentioned people who remained undecided about the invocation of this act and wonder whether the Emergencies Act was necessary to clear out Ottawa. Let's say that we might accept that some question this. Right now, the streets are cleared. Would it be possible for people to change their minds about the needs for the Act and change their opinion for the vote tonight?
I thank my colleague for his comments, and yes, I agree with the premise of his question that even if there is obviously an argument I don't agree with, but an argument on the government side that the Emergencies Act was necessary to remove the protests, I think what we can see now is that it is gone. And I think that the emergency has been dealt with, and I would ask all members to consider whether or not the Emergencies Act still is needed at this time. Thank you.
For Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member for your speech. As a new member of Parliament, I really appreciate listening to my colleagues' words today. It's been a really challenging start to my career as a member of Parliament, and to hear the words of us working together has been uplifting, to say the least. And I wanted to ask, a little bit more about that. I've been here from the onset when the occupation took over the downtown around Parliament here in Ottawa, and I've been hearing from residents of Ottawa, hearing from my constituents in Nanaimo, Ladysmith. It's a challenging time, and what many people are saying is, how do we come together? And this resonates with me, what you were talking about as well. There's a lot of misinformation
about anything, just to remind the honourable member that the member for Kenora was talking about.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm not sure exactly what I said there that went right, but thank you very much, Madam Speaker. My question is more so around how do we come together? You know, I'm seeing a lot of misinformation that's being used as a tool to divide, and the reality is that Canada is not divided. We have many vaccinated and many who are opposed to the occupation. I'm wondering if the member can speak a little bit to how we can come together.
The honourable member for Kenora in 20 seconds.
Well, Madam Speaker, obviously that's a difficult question to answer in 20 seconds. I probably need another 10-minute speech, but I think as I mentioned, it starts with us in this chamber. I think though we will disagree on many things, I know many members across the way will disagree with me on almost everything. We have to do so respectfully, and we have to do so within, I think, a responsible, reasonable scope that most Canadians can be proud of, because right now I don't think Canadians are proud when they watch what's happening in this chamber.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat. L'honorable député de Longueuil-Charlemagne.
The honourable member for Longueuil-Charlemagne.
I just want to mention right away that I will be sharing my time with the member for Brampton North. I think I lucked out in terms of the slot because I'm following two members who really spoke so eloquently in this chamber. And I want to thank them for that because I think we all have a role to play as leaders in bringing down the tone and showing that we can actually work together. I want to thank the Parliamentary Protective Services, the various municipal police forces, including the RCMP, the OPP, the Sûreté de Québec, and everyone involved in the last 3 weeks for their professionalism in bringing this situation to closure. Today we're discussing whether or not the Emergencies Act should have been used. And I will explain today why I am going to support this motion and why I think it was necessary. So when I look at it from a situational analysis, over the past 26 days, Ottawa has been under siege. We've seen protests at the Ambassador Bridge. We've seen protests at Coutts border, in Vancouver, here in Ottawa. We've seen Rideau Centre down the street closed. Hundreds and hundreds of employees who cannot go to work. We've seen fundraising with a lot of foreign interference towards this occupation. We've seen a lot of misinformation being shared on social media. I've been in Ottawa for the past 22 of the last 26 days of the occupation, and I've witnessed firsthand the constant honking, the fireworks in the streets, the open fires, citizens afraid to go out. And one of the most disturbing sights was someone jumping on. As the mother and mother-in-law of 3 serving members, this was incredibly difficult for me to witness. We've had staff members yelled at, one of which had feces thrown at her for coming to work. We've seen reporters being assaulted. We've seen stockpiling of propane and fuel. We've seen this progression despite measures that had been taken by local police. Our government has been in contact with the mayor the whole time, with the chief of police, with the premier, with various premiers in the locations at which we've seen these protests. We've deployed RCMP's officers, tactical police troops, had joint intelligence and operational teams, community liaison teams, and convened a table with relevant federal and municipal partners. And despite these efforts, it continued. And we saw, when you look at the timeline of events, very clearly an escalation. We saw the potential for this to increase. Now, I know that Wellington Street is clear right now, but we also know that protesters are currently in Van Cleek Hill. We know that protesters are just south of us, waiting. That is why I believe we are just invoking the Emergencies Act. My colleague from Windsor West has said multiple times in the last 3 days that the Ambassador Bridge is not secure. 2 blocks from him, there are protesters. It is a very volatile situation right now. It is evolving quickly, and I trust the police forces and the intelligence safe. Now, the laws we have were not sufficient. One of the most difficult things for me to see were children at these protests. The invoking of the Emergencies Act will make it punishable to bring children into these protests. It prevents travel to the Hill and border crossing by those intent on breaking laws. It prevents foreign extremists from joining in these protests. It does direct tow companies to assist in removing vehicles who are parked in our streets. It also authorizes financial institutions to freeze the funds of this illegal activity. We're talking dark money. We're talking crowdfunding to avoid FinTrack rules. It also allowed the police forces to save days of delays in deputizing various police forces. This is not something we take lightly. When this piece of legislation was drafted in 1988, the safeguards were put in place. We're having this debate. There will be a vote. A joint committee of parliamentarians will be struck. There will be an inquiry. There will be a report tabled in the House after 60 days to determine whether or not the invoking of this act was justifiable or not. I heard a lot in the last couple of days about listening. And I make a point of reaching out to citizens who write to me, especially those who are angry and don't agree, because I really want to hear their point. Most people, when they write to an MP's office, it's not to say that we're doing a great job, let's be honest. It's because they're angry about something or they're not happy with something. And I make every effort to hear them. And while we may not agree on the position, it's important that I hear them. And I'm pretty sure this is the same across all parties. We have those discussions in caucus. We share. This is what I'm hearing on the ground. This is what... Those conversations are happening. People are listening. We are listening. We have a duty to listen, and we are. We are dealing with a very, very scary situation in Canada where people feel empowered to say awful things to others, whether it be on social media from the safety behind a keyboard or to attack personally. I have no problem with someone questioning my position on something or questioning a policy that we put. But when we start taking personal attacks, we've gone too far. I think we have a lot of questions to ask coming out of what has happened here in the last month in Canada. And my honourable colleague from Timmins, James Bay, brought this up, I believe it was Saturday. I'm trying to mix up my days, Madam Speaker. I've been here for 3 days debating, where he said there should be an inquiry, a public inquiry be what happened here, in addition to the parliamentary inquiry that's stipulated in the Emergencies Act. Ottawa has festivities all the time. They're versed in crowd control. I looked up online what streets are closed normally for vehicular traffic during Canada Day celebrations. How did those trucks get on Wellington? How did a crane get put beside the PMO office? Where was the protection for the protesters walking in between trucks that were parked? There are a lot of questions to ask after this, through various channels, through various levels of government and agencies. And I hope and I welcome that, so that this never happens again. I do urge colleagues across the aisle to be mindful, and colleagues on my side as well, about the words we use, about how we express ourselves, and ask questions about what really happened here. How is it that an illegal protest like this was allowed to get so far? Because, Madam Speaker, let's be honest, if the complexion of this protest were different, this would have been called something entirely different. Thank you.
And comments, the honourable member for Bruce Grey Owen Sound.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for the tone of her speech as well. We're here to have debate and discourse, not to necessarily agree, but to actually get to the root of the issues. The real point I want to get to is, does the member believe there's still justification for this act? She hinted at some of her concerns, but the Emergencies Act is by far the most draconian, most powerful piece of legislation the federal government has. So we can't use it just to predict or to protect against the potential. It's there to deal with a national emergency that we're dealing with right now. So I'd just like her comment, Madam Speaker. Does she really think it's justified to still have this act in place now?
Member for Longueuil-Charlemagne.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank, first of all, the member opposite for his service to Canada. I know he served in the Canadian Armed Forces. Yes, I do. As I said, when the decision to invoke this act was made, it was measured and it was targeted and it's timely. And we know right now that within 2 days, the Ottawa police were able to make great advances in terms of removing the illegal protests from downtown Ottawa and in various locations, but they have not gone home. There were protests across Canada, and they continue. And I believe that the police are in the best position to tell us when they feel that we've got the situation under control. And I know that the safeguards are there, and when it is time to remove this, we will.
The honourable member for Manicouagan. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Longueuil-Charlemagne for her intervention, and to come back to a point where she mentioned the Ambassador Bridge. It's been discussed several times this morning, and she said a few blocks away from there are still some protesters, and I emphasize the word protesters. They're not occupiers. So the blockade on the bridge was dismantled before the invoking of the Emergencies Act. So it wasn't necessary. We were able to deal with that situation. So I'd like to know why, as my colleagues so aptly put it earlier, draconian measures when we have everything we need to do without. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I think that the reality is that we have all seen the fact that there were children on the Ambassador Bridge. We all knew that there was the potential for greater violence. The police, the Provincial Police of Ontario and the Premier of Ontario himself asked for these measures. Therefore, we invoked the Emergencies Act because it was upon the request of the province and the police forces.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I thank my colleague for her intervention as well, for her work on Industry Committee as the former chair. It was very much a collegial environment. As I've noted several times in interventions, the Ambassador Bridge blockade has moved from here in Church Road to now along city streets. In fact, several convoys, a couple convoys anyways, have been intercepted since this act has been in place. And I'd like to ask her, with regards to the irony, a private American billionaire now benefits from all the routing traffic quickly down there, whereas small business and employees of those businesses can't work because the current blockades and cement barriers are now preventing people from getting to their areas of businesses along the corridor.
Honourable member for Longueuil-Charlemagne.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the question, and I enjoyed working with him when I was on the Indu Committee. And I've heard him explain throughout this debate the precarious situation that is on the ground right now at the Ambassador Bridge. The fact that blocks away there are still protesters that can retake that bridge. The fact that there are issues with respect to the management of that bridge and the ownership of that bridge are things I would happily discuss with him. And I know that he means to make sure that the people in his community are able to feel safe, that the businesses in his community can continue to thrive, and that we are able to move beyond this awful period in our history. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Brampton North.
Good morning, Madam Speaker. Being able to rise today on this issue is an opportunity that I do not take lightly nor for granted. It's only in a few democratic countries like ours where the voice of someone like me would even be heard or carry any weight. Over the last several days, we've heard many points of view on the invocation of the Emergencies Act and regarding the details outlined in the declaration of the Act tabled in this House. After hearing much of the debate in this House and outside this place, I want to touch upon some key issues that I think have been misconstrued or misunderstood. First, that this is just a normal truckers' protest. Anyone thinking that is naive as to the elements that can exist within this protest, so I'll address that. But I also want to address that this isn't just a protest representing truck drivers. And if it is, if they claim that it is, they really have missed the mark. In my riding, I represent a large demographic of truck drivers, and these are not their real concerns. Third, I'll address the issue of whether this act was necessary and if it is still necessary at this time. And fourth, I'd like to show the real difference that exists between the Emergencies Act and the War Measures Act. So let's first address that this is just a normal protest. If that is what you believe, then you are either naive or you are willfully ignoring the dangerous truths that exist within this protest. We've heard from many criminologists over this last several weeks and cybersecurity experts that that is not the intention of this protest. We here, Madam Speaker, are not new to protests in Parliament, and nor is Ottawa. Ottawa is a place that has had protests for centuries, and they've constantly consisted of people wanting their say on policy or wanting to have their issues heard. In fact, this government has never silenced the voices of those who wish to protest. I myself have protested many times on this Hill in my younger years, and I strongly believe in one's ability to be able to do so. But blocking a city for over 3 weeks, shutting down its businesses,